Hey everyone, and welcome back to Decoding the Paranormal. Tonight we're peeling back the layers on a story you think you know, but one that echoes in the darkest corners of human history, whispered in languages that have long since turned to dust. It's a tale of a world washed clean by a divine flood. How is it that hundreds of cultures separated by vast oceans and insurmountable mountains, with no conceivable contact, all decided to write the same terrifying story? Before we dive into the mystery, if you're as fascinated by the unknown as I am, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us find more stories that deserve to be told. And drop a comment below with a mystery you think is due for a new look. All right, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our investigation. You can almost feel the rain, can't you? It's a cold, relentless downpour that blurs the line between sea and sky. You can smell the wet wood of a massive, impossible vessel. Hear the low calls of countless animals sheltered within its dark, swaying belly. On the deck stands a family, chosen, spared, watching as the last peaks of the old world sink beneath the churning gray water. This is the story of Noah, a cornerstone of Abrahamic faith, a tale of divine judgment and miraculous survival that has been etched into the consciousness of the Western world for millennia. It's a story so grand, so absolute, it feels singular, a one-time event, a covenant sealed with a rainbow. But what if it isn't? Imagine you are standing in a library, a vast circular room filled with the foundational texts of every civilization that has ever existed. You pull a heavy leather-bound volume from a shelf marked Ancient Near East. You open it and there it is. The story of a great flood, a chosen man, an ark, and saved animals. Then you walk to another section, this one marked Vedic India. You pull down a scroll and as you unroll the delicate parchment, the same story spills out, this time of a man named Manu, warned by a god, in the form of a fish. You cross the room, to the shelves of the Americas, pulling down records of Aztec, Mayan, and Inca belief. Again, the same narrative core. Raging waters, a handful of survivors, a world reborn from the mud. China, Australia, Greece, Africa. Page after page, culture after culture. The same story. The names change. The gods are different. The type of boat varies, but the terrifying plot remains the same. The world was drowned. This is the mystery we are exploring tonight. This isn't just about a shared motif like a trickster god or a creation myth. This is a highly specific, multi-part narrative of planetary annihilation and selective salvation, repeated with uncanny fidelity by peoples who, according to our established historical models, should never have been able to share a story. Let's start with the one that challenges our familiar narrative the most. You journey back in time, not just centuries, but millennia. You're not in ancient Israel, but in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, long before the book of Genesis was ever written, a Sumerian king named Gilgamesh, tormented by the death of his friend and the fear of his own mortality, seeks out the one man who has ever escaped it. His name is Utnapishtim. You find him living in a remote paradise and he tells you his story. He speaks of a time when the gods, angered by the clamor of mankind, decided to wipe the slate clean with a flood. But one god, Ea, took pity on him and whispered a warning through the reed walls of his hut. "Tear down your house," the god said, "and build a boat." Utnapishtim was given the vessel's precise dimensions. He was instructed to load it with his family, his craftsmen, and the seed of all living things. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. When the waters finally calmed, his boat came to rest on the peak of Mount Nisir. He sent out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. When the raven did not return, he knew the waters had receded. The familiarity is chilling, isn't it? The divine warning, the specific instructions for the vessel, the saving of animals, the birds sent to find dry land, the boat landing on a mountain. This story, inscribed on baked clay tablets nearly 4,000 years ago as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, predates the earliest estimated writing of the Genesis account by at least 1,000 years. This isn't just a similar story. For entire passages, it's virtually the same story. This single, undeniable fact opens the door to our investigation. The well-established historical account of Noah's Ark, a story many believe to be a unique revelation, is itself an echo of an older pagan tale. But this Mesopotamian blueprint, while ancient, can't explain everything. It helps us understand the link to the biblical account. The Hebrew people were, after all, exiled in Babylon and would have been exposed to these stories. This is a clear case of cultural transmission, but it doesn't explain the story's appearance in the Popol Vuh of the Quiché Maya, which speaks of a great flood sent by the god Huracan to destroy a flawed race of wooden men. It doesn't explain why the Aboriginal Gunai-Kurnai people of Australia have a tradition of a great flood that covered the entire land except for a few high mountains. Their ancestors were isolated on that continent for 50,000 years. How did they get the memo? This is where the mystery deepens, where the comfortable explanation of one story simply being copied by a neighbor falls apart. You're left staring at a global pattern that defies our understanding of history, communication, and the very origins of myth. It forces you to ask a profoundly unsettling question. Are we looking at a simple coincidence? A fluke of the human imagination repeated 100 times over? Is there some deep psychological structure in our minds, a universal archetype that bubbles up in the form of a flood, regardless of culture or geography? Or are we looking at something else? Are these hundreds of myths the scattered, fragmented, and distorted memories of one single, real event? A global catastrophe that truly did drown the world and leave a handful of terrified survivors to tell the tale to all their descendants? That question, of a single shared memory, hangs heavy in the air. To begin to answer it, you have to look past the story as a simple myth and see it as an artifact, something to be excavated. And there's no better place to dig than in the sun-baked earth of ancient Mesopotamia. Let's journey back, not to the time of the flood itself, but to a much more recent past, a foggy, gaslit London in the year 1872. You find yourself inside the grand stone halls of the British Museum. Here, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith is hunched over a collection of broken clay tablets, shipped back from an archaeological dig at the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh. These tablets, inscribed with the wedge-shaped script of cuneiform, are from the library of the great king Ashurbanipal. For weeks, Smith has been painstakingly cleaning and attempting to translate the fragments. You watch as he fits two pieces together. His eyes scan the lines of tiny, intricate symbols. Suddenly, he stands up, a look of utter astonishment on his face. The legend goes that he was so overwhelmed he began to pace the room, and to the bewilderment of his colleagues, started removing his clothes in a fit of pure academic ecstasy. Because what George Smith had just read was the story of Utnapishtim, which we touched on earlier. He had found an independent, non-biblical account of a great flood, written 1,000 years before the Genesis narrative was thought to exist. It was a discovery that sent shockwaves through the worlds of theology and history. The story of Noah, it turned out, was not unique. It had a precedent. Let's look closer at what Smith found on those tablets. The story isn't just a brief mention, it's a detailed epic poem. You can feel the weight of the god's decision. Enlil, the chief god, is infuriated by the noise and chaos of humanity. He convinces the divine assembly to send a flood to eradicate them. But Ea, the clever god of wisdom, leaks the plan to his mortal favorite, Utnapishtim. The detail of the warning is fascinating. Ea doesn't speak to him directly, which would violate his oath of secrecy to the other gods. Instead, he whispers the secret to the reed wall of Utnapishtim's house, knowing the man is on the other side. Man of Shuruppak, he says, tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and seek life. Take aboard the boat the seed of all living things. The design of the vessel is also incredibly specific. It's described not as a long ship, but as a perfect cube. An enormous coracle 120 cubits on each side, with 7 decks. Utnapishtim gathers carpenters and reed workers, paying them with beer and wine. He seals the entire structure inside and out with bitumen, a natural asphalt plentiful in the region. The description of the storm's arrival is pure, cinematic horror. You can almost see the sky turning black as the storm god Adad advances. An unholy light shatters the darkness, turning everything to blackness. The deluge is so violent that even the gods are terrified. They retreat to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, weeps for her lost children, her voice crying out like a woman in childbirth. This is a portrait not of righteous divine judgment, but of a chaotic, terrifying, and ultimately regretted act of celestial panic. But the rabbit hole goes deeper. As incredible as the discovery of the Gilgamesh account was, you soon learn it's just one layer of soil in a deep archaeological dig. This story was already ancient by the time it was incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic. If you dig further back to around 1700 BCE, you find the story told in even greater detail in another Akkadian epic called Atra Hasis. Here you get the full backstory. The junior gods were forced to dig the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and after centuries of toil, they go on strike. To solve the labor dispute, the gods create humans to be their workforce. But humanity is a wild success. We multiply, and our noise, our talking, our laughing, our living disturbs Enlil's sleep. He tries to cull the population with plague, then drought. But each time the clever god Ea tells the hero, Atra Hasis, how to survive. Finally, in a fit of rage, Enlil unleashes the flood. This is the oldest, most complete version of the story we have, and its reason for the flood is not sin or corruption, but irritation. Humanity was simply too loud. And yet, you can still dig deeper. Before the Akkadians and Babylonians, there were the Sumerians. On a badly damaged tablet from around 2150 BCE, you find the story of a hero named Ziusudra, a king so righteous he stood in humility, prostrating himself. He overhears the gods' plan to destroy humanity by flood. The text is broken, but you can make out the key phrases. A huge boat, a storm that rages for 7 days, and 7 nights, and Ziusudra making an offering to the sun god Utu when the waters recede. It's the same story, in an even older language. And then you find the Sumerian king list, a curious document that lists all the kings of the region. It lists 8 kings who ruled from 5 different cities for an astonishing 200 years. And then you read the line that divides the entire document in two. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. After that line, the reigns of the kings become shorter, more believable. For the Sumerians, the flood wasn't a myth. It was a historical event, a definitive dividing line in their timeline between a hazy, mythological past and recorded history. So you're left with a clear, documented lineage. A story passed down through millennia, from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian hands. Each culture retold it, reshaped it, changed the hero's name, and altered the gods' motivations to fit their own theology. The core, however, remained unchanged. This process of myth evolution is perfectly understandable in this context, but it begs a critical question for our larger investigation. If a story this specific can be so meticulously preserved and adapted over 2,000 years within a single geographical region, what does that tell us about how foundational myths function? Could the same process, a core memory being passed down and redressed in local culture, be the engine that drove the flood myth into every corner of the ancient world? This idea, that a core story can be preserved but redressed in the clothes of a new culture, is not just a theory. You can see it happen with astonishing clarity. For this, you need to place the cuneiform tablets of Utnapishtim and Atra Hasis side by side with the ancient Hebrew scrolls that tell the story of Noah. It's a tale of 2 arcs, 2 heroes, and 2 very different views of the divine. The similarities are so precise, so numerous, that they stretch the definition of coincidence to its breaking point. Let's lay them out, one by one, like evidence on an investigator's table. First, you have the premise. A divine power, or powers, decides that humanity has become a problem and resolves to destroy it with a great flood. In both narratives, this isn't an accident of nature. It's a deliberate, calculated act of extermination. Second, the exception. Amidst the general corruption or annoyance, one man is found worthy of being saved. Utnapishtim is the favorite of the god Ea. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Both are singled out to be the progenitors of a new human race. Third, the warning. The hero is given a secret, divine warning of the impending cataclysm. He is not left to discover it on his own. He is an agent, chosen by a higher power to enact a plan of survival. Fourth, the command to build. This isn't just a suggestion to find high ground. In both stories, the hero receives explicit instructions to build a massive vessel, an ark, to save himself and his family from the coming waters. The instructions even include the command to seal the ship with pitch or bitumen to make it waterproof. Fifth, the passengers. The hero is commanded to bring aboard his entire family, but also a representative sample of all life. Utnapishtim is told to bring the seed of all living things, while Noah is instructed to bring pairs of every kind of animal, bird, and creeping thing. The mission is not just personal survival, but the preservation of the entire planetary ecosystem. Sixth, the cataclysm. The flood arrives and wipes out all other life on Earth. Both texts describe a total destruction, a world returned to a primordial, watery chaos. Seventh, the landing. After the storm abates, the vessel comes to rest on the peak of a mountain. For Utnapishtim, it's Mount Nisir. For Noah, it's the mountains of Ararat. The high place becomes the point of contact between the drowned world and the new one to come. Eighth, and this is perhaps the most uncanny parallel, the testing of the waters. The hero needs to know if it's safe to disembark. Utnapishtim sends out a dove, which returns. He sends out a swallow, which also returns. Finally, he sends out a raven, which finds food and does not return, signaling that the waters have receded. Noah's sequence is slightly different, but structurally identical. He sends out a raven, which flies back and forth. Then he sends a dove, which returns. A week later, he sends the dove again and it returns with an olive leaf. The third time, the dove does not return. The use of the same specific birds in a specific sequence is a narrative fingerprint that is almost impossible to attribute to chance. Finally, the aftermath. The hero emerges from the ark, and his first act is to build an altar and make a sacrifice. The divine power smells the sweet savor of the offering and is pleased. The hero and his family are then blessed and given a promise that such a cataclysm will never happen again. The sheer weight of these parallels is overwhelming. You are not looking at two separate stories. You are looking at one story, told in two different languages, filtered through two different cultures. The idea that the Hebrews, during their exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE, encountered the much older Mesopotamian epics and integrated this powerful story into their own sacred history, is now the consensus among most mainstream historians and biblical scholars. But here is where it gets truly fascinating. The most compelling part of this comparison isn't the similarities, it's the differences. You see, the Hebrew scribes didn't just copy the story, they transformed it. They performed what you might call a profound theological upgrade. The Mesopotamian version is a story about a pantheon of flawed, shockingly human gods. They are driven by irritation, they bicker amongst themselves, they act impulsively, and they panic when they see the destruction they've caused. Crowding around Utnapishtim's sacrifice like flies because they are hungry. The flood is a messy, chaotic affair born of annoyance. Now look at the Genesis account. The pantheon is gone, replaced by a single, omnipotent and omniscient God. His decision is not an impulsive one. It is a deep, sorrowful, moral judgment. He doesn't destroy humanity because they are too loud. He does it because the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and the world was filled with violence. Noah is not just some God's favorite. He is a righteous man, blameless in his generation. The story is elevated from a tale of divine convenience to a cosmic drama about sin, judgment, redemption, and covenant. The arbitrary act of capricious gods becomes the just act of a moral God. This is a deliberate and brilliant piece of theological storytelling. The Hebrews took a story that was part of the cultural air they breathed in Babylon and repurposed it, imbuing it with their unique monotheistic vision. This act of transformation forces a critical question upon us. If we can see with such clarity how one culture can absorb a myth from another and completely reforge it to fit a new spiritual framework, what does this tell us about the nature of myth itself? Does this mean all the other flood myths we find around the world are simply a global game of telephone with this Mesopotamian story as the original message getting more and more distorted with each retelling until it's barely recognizable? Or is something else going on? Does this prove an act of rewriting a story to find a deeper truth within it? actually strengthen the case for a real event? Perhaps the memory of a world-shattering flood was the raw, traumatic material, and every culture in its own way was simply trying to make sense of it, trying to answer the question, why did this happen, and what does it mean for us? That question, whether we're hearing a single original story echoed and distorted through a global game of telephone, or the independent accounts of one global event, demands a true test case. To find one, you have to leave the old world behind. You must journey to a place that was, for all intents and purposes, a separate planet for over 12,000 years. You cross the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific, or travel back in time to trek across the frozen land bridge of Beringia, with the first peoples to enter a new hemisphere. You are now in the Americas, a continent of soaring mountains, dense jungles, and sprawling deserts, utterly isolated from the cultural currents of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant. If the flood myth was born solely in the Fertile Crescent, its voice should be silent here. But it is not. In fact, it is shouting. You find yourself first in the Valley of Mexico, amidst the dazzling and brutal civilization of the Aztecs. You stand before a monolithic calendar stone, the Sunstone, a disk of carved basalt that depicts a terrifying and cyclical cosmology. For the Aztecs, time is not a straight line. It is a series of worlds or suns, each created and then violently destroyed. They believed they were living in the fifth sun, the final age. You trace the carvings on the stone, and you learn the fate of the world that came before theirs. It was the fourth sun known as Nahuatl, or Forewater. This world, they believed, was populated by a race of giants who were turned into fish when the sun fell from the sky, and a cataclysmic flood inundated the entire world. The story of its ending is uncannily familiar. A man named Coxcoxtli and his wife Xochiquetzal are secretly warned of the coming destruction by the god Tezcatlipoca. They are told to build a great boat or to hollow out a massive cypress log. They take refuge inside, and the rains fall and the waters rise, swallowing every mountain. When the flood finally subsides, their vessel comes to rest on a mountain peak. So far, it's a near-perfect match for the Mesopotamian blueprint. But then, the story takes a unique turn. The children they have are all born mute. A dove appears and grants each of them the ability to speak, but they all speak in different, incomprehensible languages, scattering them across the earth. It's a flood myth and a Tower of Babel story, woven into one. Now, you travel south, high into the thin, cold air of the Andes Mountains. You are in the heart of the Inca Empire, a land of impossibly terraced farms and cities of stone that cling to the mountaintops. Here, the people tell you of the creator god, Viracocha, who rose from the waters of Lake Titicaca. He first created a world of darkness populated by a race of stone giants, but these giants were disobedient and cruel, so Viracocha decided to destroy them. He unleashed the Utnapishtim, a term in the Quechua language that means the water that overturns the land. A 60-day flood rained down from the sky, wiping the slate clean. Viracocha saved only two of his creations, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, whom he set upon an island in Lake Titicaca. From this saved pair, a new, better race of humans was born, and they would go on to found the capital city of Cusco and the Inca dynasty. Once again, you see the core components: a creator displeased with his creation, a world-ending deluge, and a chosen pair who survived to restart humanity. But perhaps the most profound and challenging version of the story comes from North America. You journey to the arid, sun-bleached mesas of what is now Arizona, home to the Hopi people. Theirs is not a story of a single flood, but of a deep, cyclical history of worlds. They believe we are now living in the fourth world, and that the three previous worlds were destroyed because humanity fell into corruption and strayed from the Creator's plan. You listen as a tribal elder tells you the story of the end of the third world, Tokpela. He explains that in this world, people had become materialistic and warlike. They used their creative power, which was meant for good, for destructive ends. The Creator, Sotuknang, saw this and decided to destroy the third world. But he sought out the few who still lived with pure hearts. He didn't tell them to build a boat. Instead, he instructed them to seek out the spider grandmother, who led them to the ant people. As the chosen few gathered, Sotuknang commanded the clouds to gather and the oceans to rise. Water poured from the sky and surged across the land. But the righteous Hopi were safe, sheltered deep underground in the kivas of the ant people, listening as the thunder of the waves rolled across the ceiling of their world. Other versions of the story have them sealing themselves inside hollow reeds with a bit of food and water, floating upon the chaos like corks in an ocean. The key here is the variation in the survival method. The universal element is the flood itself, the memory of total destruction by water. The local adaptation is how their ancestors survived it. So now you must stand back and survey the evidence. You have three powerful civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Hopi, separated by thousands of miles and with vastly different cultures, all sharing a foundational myth of a world destroyed by water. The idea that this story was carried from Mesopotamia passed across Asia, trekked over the Bering Land Bridge, and then disseminated and preserved for over 10,000 years to pop up with such clarity in these disconnected cultures seems almost more fantastic than the flood itself. This isolation presents a stark choice, a fork in the path of our investigation. Are you looking at a stunning case of convergent psychological evolution, where the human mind, hardwired with certain archetypes, independently generates the same story of destruction and rebirth? Or does the very independence of these accounts make them the most powerful witnesses we have? Does this prove the story is not a myth but a memory of a real global cataclysm that was experienced by the ancestors of all people? A trauma seared into our collective consciousness before we ever scattered across the separate continents of the Earth? The riddle of the Americas, with its stories emerging from a vacuum of isolation, leaves you with two possibilities: a trick of the human mind, or a memory of a shared reality. To find more evidence, you must leave the New World and cross the largest, most formidable barrier on the planet, the Pacific Ocean. Your journey takes you to the teeming, ancient lands of Asia, and beyond that, to the enigmatic continent of Oceania. If the flood story is a universal constant, it must have a powerful voice here as well. And it does. You arrive in the Indian subcontinent, a land of vibrant gods and epic poems that stretch back to the dawn of civilization. You find yourself on the banks of a sacred river where a wise and righteous man, the son of the sun god, is performing his morning prayers. His name is Manu. As he cups water in his hands to offer it to the heavens, a tiny fish miraculously appears in his palms. "Protect me," the fish pleads, "and I will save you." Manu, filled with compassion, places the fish in a small water jar. But overnight, the fish grows, and the jar is too small. Manu moves it to a pond, but soon the pond is too small. He moves it to the river, and then to the mighty Ganges, and finally, when it has grown to a colossal size, he releases it into the ocean. As it departs, the great fish, the Matsya, reveals its true nature. It is an avatar of the great god Vishnu, the preserver of the cosmos. It speaks to Manu, warning him that the world is to be cleansed. The time is ripe for a purging of the world, the fish says. A great flood will soon rise and submerge everything. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a massive ship and to load it not only with his family, but with the 7 primordial sages and the seeds of every plant and animal. When the rains begin and the oceans begin to swell, swallowing the coastlines, Manu does as he was told. The great fish returns, a horn now protruding from its head. Manu ties the rope of his ship to the horn, and for the duration of the cataclysm, the divine fish guides the ship safely through the churning, world-drowning chaos. As the waters recede, the fish pulls the ship to a high peak in the Himalayan mountains. From this vessel, Manu performs a sacrifice, and from this sacrifice, a woman is born. Together, they become the progenitors of all humanity in the New Age. The parallels to the narratives from Mesopotamia and the Bible are once again staggering. A righteous hero, a divine warning from a single benevolent deity, the command to build a ship, the preservation of the seeds of life, and the final landing on a mountain. This story, first recorded in the Shatapatha Brahmana around the 8th century BCE, is one of the oldest and most influential in Hindu scripture. Given that extensive trade and cultural links existed between the Mesopotamian and Indus Valley civilizations, It is entirely plausible that this is another case of diffusion, the same potent story making its way east and being woven into the rich tapestry of Vedic belief. It fits the model. But now you must push that model to its absolute breaking point. You journey further south to a land that time seems to have forgotten, a continent that has been almost completely isolated for 50,000 years. Australia. You stand in a landscape of red earth and ancient rock, under a canopy of unfamiliar stars. Here you don't find a single codified text, but a living library of oral traditions that have been passed down for millennia, a worldview known as the dreaming. These are not just quaint fireside tales. They are complex maps of the land, of society, of the law, and of time itself. And embedded within the dreaming of many different Aboriginal peoples are stories of a great flood. These stories are not of a man in a boat. They are rawer, more primal. You listen to the Gunai people of Victoria, and they tell you of a time when their land extended far out into what is now the sea. They speak of a period of great turmoil and social transgression, followed by a terrifying flood that came from the ocean and drowned the low-lying plains, creating the bays and islands that define their coastline today. In Arnhem Land, you hear tales of Yurlungur, the great rainbow serpent who sleeps in a deep waterhole. When disturbed, the serpent can rise up in fury and flood the land, swallowing the profane and impure. Many of these stories are deeply connected to the physical landscape. They are less about the salvation of a single hero and more about explaining how their world was shaped. Geologists now confirm that around 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the sea level around Australia rose dramatically, by over 100 meters, flooding vast coastal shelves that were once dry, habitable land. The stories in the dreaming seem to record this very event. They are a form of oral geology, a memory of a drowned world passed down for 300 generations. Now you are faced with a profound puzzle. The Hindu story of Manu could conceivably be a distant cousin of the Utnapishtim myth. But the Australian stories, from a people genetically and culturally isolated since the dawn of modern humanity, they share no plausible link to Mesopotamia or India or even the Americas. And yet, here is the same core memory. The world was once overwhelmed by water. This brings you to a startling and necessary question. We have been searching for the origin of the flood myth in the first civilizations, Sumer, Babylon, the Indus Valley. But what if we've been looking in the wrong place at the wrong time? What if the Australian myths, preserved in near total isolation, are the most authentic echoes of the original event? Does this force us to consider that the story is not 5 or even 10,000 years old, but maybe far older, a story that predates civilization itself, a memory seared into the consciousness of our species when we were still scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, a tale carried out of Africa and into every corner of the globe? This radical idea, that the flood myth might be a 50,000-year-old memory, forces you to re-examine every version of the story, even those from the cultures you think you know best. You must now leave the ancient dreaming continent of Australia and travel to what is often considered the birthplace of modern Western thought, Europe. Here, in the land of marble philosophies and epic histories, you would expect to find myths grounded in a more rational, or at least a more recent worldview. You expect the whispers of primeval trauma to have faded. But when you arrive, you find the same story waiting for you, carved into the very foundations of European mythology. Your first stop is ancient Greece. You stand in the shadow of the Acropolis, the air thick with the ghosts of Socrates and Plato. The Greeks were observers, classifiers, thinkers who sought to bring order to a chaotic world. Yet, when they told the story of their own deep past, they told of a world washed clean by water. You listen to the poet Ovid as he recounts the tale. Zeus, the king of the gods, looks down from Mount Olympus and is utterly disgusted by the state of humanity in the Iron Age. He sees a world rife with cruelty, greed, and blasphemy, where guest murders host and brother turns against brother. He decides the only cure is annihilation. His plan is to destroy the world with a great flood, but Prometheus, the titan who had fashioned humanity from clay and had always been our champion, learns of the plot. He goes to his mortal son, Deucalion, a man renowned for his justice and piety, and warns him of the coming doom. Following his father's counsel, Deucalion builds a large wooden chest, a larnax. He and his wife, Pyrrha, provision it and then climb inside, sealing themselves in just as Zeus shatters the sky with thunder and unleashes a punishing, unnatural rain. He calls upon his brother Poseidon, god of the sea, who strikes the earth with his trident, releasing rivers and summoning the oceans to surge over the land. The water rises until the highest towers are submerged, and only the twin peaks of Mount Parnassus remain above the endless sea. For 9 days and nights, the chest containing Deucalion and Pyrrha is tossed on the waves until it finally comes to rest on the muddy slopes of that last sacred mountain. When they emerge, they are utterly alone. The world is silent, empty. In their grief, they make a sacrifice and pray at a surviving temple to the goddess Themis. The goddess speaks, but in the cryptic language of oracles, "Go from the temple, and with veiled heads and loosened robes, throw behind you the bones of your great mother." Pyrrha is horrified at the thought of desecrating her mother's grave, but the wise Deucalion understands the riddle. Their great mother is Gaia, the earth herself, and her bones are the stones of the land. And so, as they walk down the mountain, they throw stones over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion transform into men. Those thrown by Pyrrha become women. And from this act, the world is repopulated. It's a story that fits the global pattern almost perfectly, another clear echo of the Mesopotamian and Hebrew model, easily explainable by the busy trade routes and cultural exchange of the ancient Mediterranean. But now you must travel north, into a vastly different world. You leave the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean for the cold, misty fjords of Scandinavia. This is the land of the Norse, a world of ice and fire, of grim gods and heroic, doomed warriors. Their worldview is not one of civil order and philosophical debate, but of cosmic struggle and inevitable destruction. And here, hidden within their violent creation story, you find one of the strangest and most primal flood myths of all. You are told of the beginning of the great yawning void called Ginnungagap. From the north came the ice of Niflheim, from the south the fire of Muspelheim. Where they met, the ice melted and the drops formed the first living being, a colossal frost giant named Ymir. From his sweat, other giants were born. At the same time, a cosmic cow emerged, and from the salty ice block she licked, the first of the gods appeared. These gods, Odin and his two brothers, grew strong, but they lived in a world dominated by Ymir and his violent, chaotic offspring. To create a world of order, they had to kill the father of all giants. They succeed, slaying Ymir in a titanic battle. And it is here, in this act of primordial deicide, that the flood occurs. The blood that erupts from Ymir's wounds is a deluge, a torrent so vast and overwhelming that it drowns the entire race of frost giants. It is a crimson flood that scours the early world clean. But just as in every other story, there is an exception. One frost giant, Bergelmir, and his wife were warned or were clever enough to find a means of escape. They climb into a looter, a curious word that can be translated as a hollowed-out log, a chest, or an ark. In this vessel, they float upon the sea of their progenitor's blood until the tide subsides. They land on a new shore and become the ancestors of a new race of giants, the eternal enemies of the gods. The gods then build our world, Midgard, from Ymir's corpse. You are now left with two European flood myths. One, from Greece, is a familiar moral drama. It is about human sin and divine judgment, a story that would be at home in Genesis or Gilgamesh. The other, from the Norse, is a savage, amoral, cosmic event. It's not a flood of water, but of blood. It's not about punishing humans, but about wiping out a rival race of supernatural beings. Yet the deep structure, the archetypal pattern, is identical. A world-ending flood, and a single family surviving in a wooden vessel to continue their kind. So how can this be? Why would these two cultures, both part of the broader European tapestry, possess such radically different tellings of the same essential catastrophe? Is it possible that you are seeing the fossil record of a myth's evolution, showing how a single, unimaginably ancient memory of a real event was filtered through two completely different cultural minds, one agricultural and civilizational, the other tribal and shamanic, each shaping the raw trauma into a story that made sense of their own world? This journey through the mythologies of Europe, with its civilized Greek retelling and its primal Norse version, showcases how a core story can be shaped by different cultural worldviews. We've now seen the flood myth in the Near East, the Americas, Asia, Australia, and Europe. You have a map in your mind and you begin to connect the dots, seeing a web of stories that covers nearly the entire globe. But there is a vast, conspicuous, and troubling blank spot right in the middle of your map: Africa. In most popular tellings of this mystery, the African continent is an afterthought, a footnote at best. This is a critical and deeply misleading omission, for if we are entertaining the hypothesis of a truly ancient memory, a story carried by our earliest ancestors, then we must go to the source. You must journey to the cradle of all humanity. You travel to a continent of staggering diversity, of sweeping savannas, impenetrable rainforests, and ancient deserts. The stories here are not, for the most part, written on clay or papyrus. They are alive, carried in the memories and voices of storytellers, passed down through generations in a powerful and resilient chain of oral tradition. To ignore these voices is to ignore a huge piece of the puzzle. When you stop and listen, you find that the memory of a great flood is here too. You find yourself on the eastern shores of Lake Victoria, in the lands of the Kwaya people of Tanzania. An elder begins to tell you a story. A long time ago, the ocean god decided to flood the earth. He sent 2 spiders to a man named Masasi and a woman named Masi, warning them of the coming disaster. The voice of the god told them to build a great ship and to put it on a flat-topped acacia tree. They were to take on board their children and the seeds of every kind of grain and pairs of every kind of animal, from the elephant to the smallest mouse. They did as they were told. The rains began, and the waters of the lake rose, joining the ocean, until even the highest peak of Kilimanjaro was submerged. All other life was destroyed. After a long time, the waters began to recede. The ship came to rest, and the survivors disembarked to become the ancestors of everyone on Earth. The sheer, point-for-point similarity to the Noah and Utnapishtim narrative is breathtaking. A warning, a specific instruction to build a boat, the saving of family, seeds, and animals, a universal flood covering the highest mountains, and the eventual salvation of the chosen few. How did this story find its way here, into the heart of Africa? But to assume all African flood myths are perfect copies of the Near Eastern model would be a mistake. The continent's traditions are far too rich and diverse for that. You travel west, deep into the Ituri forest of the Congo, to the home of the Mbuti people. Here, the story is utterly different. There is no angry god, no sinful humanity, no moral judgment. Instead, there is a story of cosmic accident and curiosity. You are told of a time when a chameleon, a creature of great significance in many African myths, heard a strange rumbling sound coming from inside a tall tree. Intrigued, and perhaps a little frightened, the chameleon took its spear and stabbed at the trunk to see what was inside. It was a fatal mistake. A torrent of water burst forth from the wound in the tree. The gush became a flood, and the flood grew until it had covered the entire forest world. In this version, there is no ark. The people are drowned. The only survivor is a single pregnant woman who managed to cling to the very top of the tallest tree, and from her the world was slowly and painfully repopulated. Here the flood is not an act of divine will, but the result of a single ill-considered act, a puncturing of some sacred water-bearing vessel. You see this pattern elsewhere. The Yoruba of Nigeria tell of the sea god Olokun, who in a fit of rage decides to drown the world not because of human sin, but because of a rivalry with the other gods. He is stopped and chained only when another god intervenes. These stories present a fundamentally different perspective. The flood is not a deliberate moral cleansing, but a manifestation of chaos, accidental, arbitrary, a force of nature, or the result of a squabble between deities. This brings you face to face with a fascinating paradox. We've established that the flood myth is undeniably present in Africa, in forms both strikingly familiar and radically different. But this presence raises a difficult question for the theory that the myth is a 50,000-year-old memory from before the out-of-Africa migrations. If that were the case, shouldn't Africa be the myth's absolute epicenter? Shouldn't its traditions be the most widespread, the most detailed, the foundational text from which all others are derived? The evidence is ambiguous. While the stories exist, they don't appear with the same seeming universality as they do on other continents. So what does this mean for our investigation? Does the African evidence weaken the case for a single, global prehistoric catastrophe? Or does it suggest a different timeline entirely? Perhaps the great migrations out of Africa happened before the cataclysmic event we are tracking. Perhaps the ancestors of Europeans, Asians, Australians, and Native Americans experienced a world-changing flood in the Northern Hemisphere that the populations who remained in Africa were largely spared from, leaving them with their own, more ancient mythologies and more localized flood memories. The African evidence doesn't solve the puzzle. It adds a crucial, complex, and challenging new layer to the mystery. You have now completed your circumnavigation of the globe, a journey through the deepest, darkest, and most foundational stories of humanity. You have collected fragments from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the scrolls of the Levant, the oral traditions of the Americas, the epic poems of India, the ancient dreaming of Australia, the classical verses of Greece, the savage Eddas of the North, and the vibrant living histories of Africa. The collection is vast. The variations are dizzying. You've seen floods of water and floods of blood. You've seen floods born of divine anger and floods born of cosmic accident. It would be easy to get lost in the noise, in the contradictions, and to declare the whole thing an unsolvable mess. But that's not what a good investigator does. Now is the time to lay all the evidence out on the table. You must step back, filter out the local color, the names of the gods, the specific type of boat, the species of the bird, and look for the underlying structure, the blueprint that is shared beneath the surface. When you do this, a startlingly clear and coherent pattern emerges. It's a core narrative with at least 6 distinct and recurring chapters, a sequence of events that appears with such fidelity across cultures that it feels less like a coincidence and more like a formula. First, there is the divine cause. The flood is never presented as a purely natural event. It is always an act of will, initiated by a supernatural power. In the majority of the stories, this is a deliberate act of judgment. A god, or a council of gods, looks upon the world and is displeased. The cause varies. It might be moral corruption and violence, as in the Genesis account, impiety, as in the Greek myth of Deucalion, or simply the fact that humanity has become an intolerable nuisance, too loud for the gods to sleep, as in the Mesopotamian epic of Atra Hasis. Regardless of the reason, the decision is made. The current state of affairs must end. Second, there is the warning. The destruction is total, but it is not a surprise, at least not for everyone. A single hero or a single family is chosen to receive a private, divine warning. Noah is instructed by God. Utnapishtim is warned by the whispers of Ea through a reed wall. Manu is told by the fish avatar of Vishnu. Deucalion is alerted by his Titan father Prometheus. This is a crucial narrative step. It establishes the hero as special, as having a connection to the divine realm, and it transforms the story from a simple tragedy into a mission. Third, there is the chosen hero. The survivor is never chosen at random. He is always singled out for a specific quality. He is righteous in his generation like Noah, exceptionally wise like Manu, or simply a favorite of a particular god like Utnapishtim. This hero becomes the bottleneck through which all of humanity must pass, the single point of continuity between the drowned world and the new one. He is the keeper of the flame. Fourth, there is the vessel of salvation. Survival is almost always predicated on human action, specifically, the building of a protective vessel. An ark, a chest, a hollowed-out log, a great ship. The hero must use the divine instructions to construct a haven that can withstand the watery chaos. In the few versions where a boat isn't the method, like the Hopi myth of the ant people, the principle of a sealed, protected enclosure remains. Survival is not about finding high ground beforehand. It's about riding out the destruction in a specially prepared container. Fifth, there is the preservation of life. The hero's mission is rarely just to save himself and his family. He is tasked with a grander purpose, to act as the custodian of all life. He must bring aboard his vessel pairs of animals, the seed of all living things, the 7 great sages of wisdom, or the seeds of every plant. The vessel is not a lifeboat, it is a bioarchive, a genetic and cultural time capsule designed to reboot an entire planetary ecosystem. And sixth, there is the sacred mountain. The cataclysm eventually ends, and the vessel comes to rest on a high place, a mountain that was the first land to emerge from the receding waters. Ararat, Nisir, Parnassus, the Himalayas. This mountain becomes the nexus point of the new world, the sacred ground where humanity gets its second chance. It's the stage for the first sacrifice, the first covenant, the first steps in a world washed clean. Looking at this six-part structure, you realize something profound. It's not just a memory of a flood, it's a detailed survival plan. But there's one more, less discussed thread running through many of these myths. The idea that the creation destroyed by the flood was an inherently flawed prototype. The stone giants created by Viracocha were disobedient. The wooden men of the Mayan Popol Vuh were mindless and ungrateful. The noisy humans of Atra Hasis were just poorly designed biological machines. In these versions, the flood isn't just a punishment. It's a necessary reset, a cosmic recall to fix a design flaw in the original creation. It's a story about evolution, not just judgment. So why this pattern? Why this incredibly specific multi-act drama, repeated across continents and millennia? If it were simply a memory of a big flood, the stories could be much simpler. This complex structure makes you wonder, could the myth itself be a technology? Could it have been intelligently designed as a message in a bottle, a narrative vessel crafted to carry a critical warning and a survival blueprint across the treacherous ocean of time? Is the story's very structure, its drama, its hero, its divine stakes, a kind of mnemonic armor, a form of non-degradable data storage that ensures the core instructions are preserved, even as the details get corrupted by thousands of years of retelling? The question of a message in a bottle, a survival guide passed down through myth, is a tantalizing one. It implies an intelligence, a sender, a deliberate act of communication from the deep past. But before you look for the source of the message in the external world, in a lost civilization or an ancient catastrophe, you must consider another, perhaps more profound possibility. What if the bottle is not made of glass but of consciousness? What if the message is not from a forgotten ancestor, but from the deepest, most ancient parts of ourselves? To explore this, you must turn away from geology and archaeology and venture into the unmapped territory of the human mind. Your guide on this leg of the journey is the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. He was an explorer, not of continents or ruins, but of the vast inner landscape of the psyche. Jung proposed that beneath your personal unconscious, the repository of your own forgotten memories and repressed feelings, lies a much deeper, more ancient layer. He called it the collective unconscious. This, he argued, is not individual but universal. It is the psychic inheritance of all humanity, a shared foundation of instinctual patterns and images that are the result of millions of years of our ancestors' common experiences. The contents of this collective unconscious, he said, are archetypes. Think of them as blueprints for understanding the world. They are not specific memories or ideas, but rather innate, universal predispositions to perceive and react to life in certain ways. The archetype of the mother, for instance, doesn't mean you are born with a picture of your own mother in your head. It means you are born with a built-in capacity to recognize and respond to the concept of motherliness, of nurturing fertility and comfort. The hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the trickster. These are all archetypes, recurring characters in the drama of the human psyche that we see played out in myths and dreams across every culture in history. From this perspective, the Great Flood myth is not a memory of an event that happened in the outer world, but a symbolic story of an event that happens in our inner world. It is one of the most powerful and fundamental archetypes of them all, the archetype of destruction and rebirth. To understand this, you have to decode the symbols. In the language of the unconscious, water is its own primary symbol. It represents the vast, mysterious, and dangerously powerful sea of the unconscious mind itself. It is the source of all life and creativity, but it also has the power to dissolve, to overwhelm, to drown the fragile island of our conscious awareness, our ego. You see it now, don't you? The flood is a psychic crisis. It is the moment in a person's life, or in a culture's life, when the unconscious rises up. The repressed contents, the fears, the traumas, the unlived potential, surge forth and overwhelm the established order of the conscious mind. The old world, with its familiar structures and certainties, is washed away. This can feel like a descent into madness, a total loss of control, a psychological drowning. This is the divine judgment, the righteous anger of the deep psyche against a conscious life that has become too rigid, too corrupt, too disconnected from its own roots. And the ark? The ark is the vessel of consciousness, the container of the self that must be built to navigate this terrifying inner journey. It is the conscious effort to preserve the essential core of your identity when everything else is falling apart. You are Noah, Utnapishtim, Deucalion. You are building a space within yourself to hold on to what matters. The animals and seeds you take on board are the seeds of life, your essential instincts, your core values, your creative potential, your hopes for the future. The ark is the fragile part of you that floats upon the chaos, preserving a flicker of identity in the overwhelming darkness. The landing on the sacred mountain, then, signifies the successful resolution of the crisis. The waters of the unconscious recede. A new, stable psychic ground emerges from the chaos. This new ground is higher, more integrated than the old world that was washed away. You have survived the flood of the unconscious and have emerged with a new, more complete understanding of yourself. You are reborn. The world is reborn. The story's universality, in this reading, has nothing to do with a shared historical event. It is universal because the potential for this inner crisis of dissolution and reintegration is a fundamental part of the human condition. We all face floods in our lives. The myth provides the map. This psychological explanation is incredibly elegant. It accounts for the global reach of the story, its emotional power, and its uncanny structural similarities without requiring a single drop of historical floodwater. But as with every answer in this investigation, it immediately gives rise to a new and more difficult question. Does the existence of a psychological archetype preclude the existence of a real historical event? Archetypes, Jung believed, are the psychic residue of eons of repeated, typical, and powerful human experiences. We have a primal fear of snakes because for millions of years our ancestors had deadly encounters with them. So what if the flood archetype is so potent, so universal, so deeply embedded in our collective unconscious for one simple reason? Because our distant ancestors, all of them, on every continent, truly did experience a world-drowning cataclysm. Did the mind invent the story, or did a real world-shattering event create the archetype in the first place? The Jungian rabbit hole is deep and compelling. The possibility that the flood is a story we tell about ourselves, rather than a story about the world, seems to explain everything with a neat psychological elegance. But now you must pull back from the world of archetypes and the unconscious and plant your feet firmly on the ground. You must listen to the voice of scientific reason, of geology, archaeology, and history. This voice offers an explanation that is far less mystical, but for many, far more convincing. It asks you to abandon the search for a single global event and instead consider a simpler, more powerful idea. What if we are not looking for one great flood, but thousands of them? This is the local flood theory, and it stands as the mainstream scientific consensus. The premise is straightforward. There was no single world-drowning deluge. The geological record is silent on this matter. There is no universal sediment layer that would be the undeniable fingerprint of such an event. Instead, the theory proposes that the flood myths are the powerful, culturally magnified memories of real but localized catastrophic floods. And devastating floods, as we know, are a universal feature of the human experience. Let's return to Mesopotamia, the cradle of the earliest written version of the myth. You are standing on the flat, alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. For the early Sumerians, these rivers were everything. They were the source of the life-giving water and silt that made agriculture possible, that allowed civilization to be born. But they were also agents of terrifying and unpredictable destruction. An unusually heavy snowmelt in the distant mountains or a season of torrential rains could cause the rivers to swell into an unstoppable brown tide. Now imagine you are an early Sumerian farmer. Your entire world is the plain you can see from your village. Your cosmology is limited to the sky above and the flat earth beneath your feet. One season, the waters begin to rise. Not just a little, but relentlessly. The riverbanks vanish. The fields become a muddy sea. The water invades your village, collapsing the reed huts and mud brick buildings. You scramble to the highest point you can find, perhaps a temple mound, and you look out. In every direction, as far as your eye can see, there is only a churning, debris-filled ocean where your world used to be. The sky is black with rain, and the water is still rising. From your perspective, is this not a global flood? Your entire world, the only one you have ever known, has been drowned. It would be the most natural thing in the world for the survivors of such an event to describe it in absolute terms. The whole world was covered by water, and we alone survived. This is the engine of the local flood theory. You can take this model and apply it anywhere. A coastal village in pre-Columbian Peru with no warning is obliterated by a tsunami generated by a submarine earthquake. For the terrified survivors, the ocean itself rose up to swallow the land. A community in the Indus Valley is wiped out by a catastrophic monsoon that causes the river to change its course, erasing cities from existence. The Chinese Empire is built on a constant, desperate battle to tame the devastating floods of the Yellow River, the River of Sorrow. Every culture that lived near water, be it a river, a lake, or an ocean, has a deep ancestral memory of its destructive power. And sometimes these local floods were on a scale that beggars the modern imagination. You are not just looking at big river floods. You must consider the geological evidence for prehistoric megafloods. Around 200 years ago, you are a hunter-gatherer living on the coast of what is now Scotland. Your people have lived here for generations, on a low-lying plain that extends far out from the current shoreline. One day, the sea simply rises up. A wall of water, perhaps 20 meters high, appears on the horizon and thunders inland, not as a breaking wave, but as a terrifyingly fast-rising tide that scours the landscape clean. This was the Storegga Slide tsunami, caused by a piece of the Norwegian continental shelf the size of Iceland collapsing into the ocean. It was a real event, and it would have been utter Armageddon for anyone who witnessed it. Its memory could easily have been passed down as a story of the sea god's anger, a flood that came from the abyss to cleanse the world. This theory has tremendous explanatory power. It accounts for why flood myths are so common around the world, because catastrophic floods are common. It accounts for the variations in the stories, because the nature of the flood and the culture of the people were different in each location. It is grounded in observable geology and a common-sense understanding of human psychology. It does not require us to believe in a single miraculous event that defies the laws of physics. It is the rational, elegant, and scientifically accepted solution to the puzzle. And yet, you are left with a nagging question. You look back at the blueprint, the six-part structure we identified. A local flood, no matter how terrifying, is a chaotic event. Does it naturally lead a culture to independently invent a complex narrative involving a single righteous hero, warned by a god, who is then tasked with building a specific type of vessel to save a specific cargo of animals and seeds, who then sends out birds to test the waters before landing on a mountain to offer a sacrifice? The local flood theory brilliantly explains why nearly every culture has a story about a big flood, but does it adequately explain why so many cultures in complete isolation seem to be telling the exact same story about that flood? Is it plausible that dozens of different peoples, experiencing different kinds of floods in different parts of the world, all channeled that trauma into the same highly specific multi-act drama? Or is the uncanny similarity of the plot itself still a ghost that this theory cannot quite lay to rest? The local flood theory is a fortress of rationality. It explains so much so neatly, and yet it has that one nagging vulnerability: the sheer uncanny specificity of the myth's global blueprint. It feels incomplete. What if there's a way to reconcile the two sides of our investigation so far? What if there was a single global process that triggered thousands of catastrophic local floods all over the world over a prolonged period? What if the trauma was both universal in its cause and local in its effect? To find this potential solution, you have to rewind the clock past the dawn of civilization, past the invention of agriculture, into the deep, frozen heart of the prehistoric world. You are standing on the Earth 20,000 years ago. It is the height of the last ice age, a period known as the last glacial maximum. You would not recognize the planet. Mile-thick sheets of ice cover most of North America and Northern Europe. The air is colder, drier, and because so much of the world's water is locked up in these colossal glaciers, the oceans are profoundly different. The sea level is nearly 400 feet, or 120 meters, lower than it is today. This isn't just a number, it's a completely redrawn map of the world. Great Britain is not an island, but a frozen peninsula of Europe. Australia and New Guinea are a single larger continent called Sahol. The islands of Indonesia are part of a vast Southeast Asian landmass called Sundaland, and a wide grassy plain connects Siberia to Alaska. For the scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who are our only ancestors, these exposed continental shelves were the richest, most desirable real estate on the planet. They were the coastlines, the estuaries, the river valleys teeming with fish, birds, and game. This was their home. This was their world. Now you watch as the planet begins to change. The great climatic cycles that govern the ice ages shift. The Earth begins to warm, and the ice begins to melt. This is the Great Thaw, a geological event that would completely reshape the globe and, quite possibly, sear a permanent trauma into the memory of our species. The process is slow, but its scale is unimaginable. You can almost hear the groaning and cracking of the ice sheets as trillions of tons of frozen water begin to bleed back into the oceans. For the people living on those ancient coasts, this was the beginning of a slow-motion apocalypse. The flood was not a 40-day storm. It was a relentless, multi-generational invasion. Imagine you are a member of a coastal tribe. Your grandfather tells you stories of a sacred hunting ground, a place his grandfather used to take him, that is now permanently underwater. Your own children play on a beach that, by the time they are old, will be gone. The sea is a hungry, creeping monster that is slowly, methodically devouring your entire world. Generation after generation, you are forced to retreat, abandoning sacred sites, ancestral burial grounds, and familiar hunting territories to the inexorable rise of the water. Your people's story becomes one of a paradise lost, a homeland drowned beneath the waves. This process was not always gradual. Paleoclimatologists have discovered evidence of periods where the melting accelerated dramatically. These are known as meltwater pulses. The most significant of these, meltwater pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. For a period of about 350 years, the sea level rose at a terrifying rate, perhaps as much as 20 times faster than it is rising today. This would not have been an imperceptible generational change. This would have been a visible, aggressive advance of the sea within a single human lifetime. It would have felt like the world was truly and rapidly coming to an end. It would have been a cataclysm. Here you may have the perfect candidate for the origin of the flood myth. It was a single global event, the melting of the ice caps. It produced thousands of local floods, as every coastline on Earth was submerged. It would explain why peoples as separated as the Aboriginal Australians and the first Americans could have a shared memory of a drowned world. Their ancestors on opposite sides of the planet were living through the exact same trauma at the exact same time. It explains the deep psychological resonance of a lost golden age, a paradise now resting at the bottom of the sea, a story that sounds suspiciously like the myth of Atlantis. This theory aligns perfectly with the known geological facts. It provides a universal mechanism that connects every corner of the planet. It is a powerful, elegant, and scientifically plausible source for a universal memory of a great flood. But it hinges on one breathtaking assumption. The Great Thaw and its most dramatic pulses were largely over by about 7,000 years ago. The first written version of the flood myth, the Sumerian story of Ziusudra, doesn't appear for another 5,000 years after that. This forces you to confront a truly profound question about the nature of human memory. Can an oral tradition survive that long? Could the story of a coastline lost to the waves 10,000 years ago be passed down, from storyteller to storyteller, for more than 500 consecutive generations, surviving the invention of farming, the founding of cities, the creation of empires, and the development of writing, to finally be inscribed on a clay tablet in a Sumerian city? Is human memory, woven into myth and song, truly that resilient? The question of memory's endurance is a formidable barrier. Can a story truly survive for 10,000 years? The idea stretches the limits of what we know about oral tradition. But what if the memory doesn't have to be that old? The Great Thaw was a planet-wide process, but its most dramatic effects were often delayed, creating geological time bombs. What if one of these bombs went off much later, much closer to the dawn of civilization, creating a cataclysm so profound that its echo became the myth that has haunted us ever since? To investigate this, you must travel to the shores of the Black Sea. Today, you see a vast inland sea of salt water, connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow, bustling Strait of the Bosphorus. But 8,000 years ago, the view would have been utterly different. You would be standing on the shore of a giant freshwater lake. Because the ice sheets of the last ice age had locked up so much of the world's water, this lake sat in a deep depression, its surface hundreds of feet below the level of the distant Mediterranean. The land that is now the floor of the Black Sea was then a vast fertile basin, a Neolithic paradise. You can imagine the scene: gentle rivers snaking through lush plains, early farming villages dotting the shoreline, a stable, peaceful world centered on the shores of this placid lake. Meanwhile, outside this sheltered basin, the Great Thaw was in full effect. The world's oceans were rising, swollen by the melting of the continental ice sheets. The Mediterranean crept higher and higher. For millennia, a high ridge of rock at what is now the Bosphorus acted as a natural dam, holding the mighty Mediterranean at bay. But the water was relentless. It rose year after year, inch by inch, pressing against that dam. And then a tipping point was reached. In the 1990s, two geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, were studying sediment cores drilled from the deep floor of the Black Sea. They were like detectives examining the layers of time, and they found a crucial clue. There was a sharp, distinct line in the mud. Below the line, the microscopic shells belonged to hardy freshwater mollusks. Above the line, abruptly and with no transition, all the shells belonged to saltwater species native to the Mediterranean. The evidence was undeniable. At some point, a catastrophic saltwater flood had transformed the freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. But Ryan and Pittman went further. Based on carbon dating and seismic profiling of the seafloor, they proposed a theory of a cataclysm of truly biblical proportions. Around 5600 BCE, they argue, the rising waters of the Mediterranean finally breached the Bosphorus Dam. At first it might have been a trickle, but the pressure was too great. The rock gave way. You have to try to imagine the sheer violence of what happened next. A channel was carved out, and the full force of the Mediterranean began to pour into the low-lying basin. This wasn't a river. It was a waterfall 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, roaring with a sound that would have been deafening from 100 miles away. For the people living in those peaceful farming villages on the lakeshore, it would have been the end of the world. They would have seen the lake begin to rise, not slowly, but at a terrifying pace, perhaps 6 inches a day. The shoreline wouldn't have been creeping inland, it would have been galloping. Ryan and Pittman calculated that the water could have advanced across the flat plains at a rate of nearly a mile every single day. One day the water is a distant shimmer on the horizon. The next, it is at your doorstep. The entire basin, an area the size of Florida, was inundated. These people were not just flooded, they were refugees of a geological war, forced to flee for their lives as their world was systematically and violently erased behind them. Here you have a candidate for the flood that is almost too perfect. The timing, around 7,600 years ago, is just right. It's late enough for advanced Neolithic farming communities to be living there, and early enough for their story to be passed down orally for 2 millennia to the Sumerians in nearby Mesopotamia, who were the first to write it down. The geography is perfect. The traumatized survivors would have scattered in all directions, including south, towards the Fertile Crescent, carrying with them a memory of a flood that was, from their perspective, total and universal, a story of their paradise lost, drowned by a vengeful god from the sea. It seems to solve everything. You have a datable event, a plausible mechanism, and a clear line of transmission to the oldest written myth. So, have you found it? Is this the historical event that became the story of Utnapishtim and later of Noah? It is a powerful and compelling case. But in solving the mystery of the Mesopotamian myth, you may have inadvertently deepened the mystery of all the others. If this specific regional event is the source, then how do you explain the global pattern? Why would a story about the flooding of the Black Sea Basin become a story about a flood that covered the highest mountains on Earth, from the Himalayas to the Andes? And more critically, how does an event that happened in 7,600-year-old Turkey explain the uncanny existence of a near-identical myth among the Hopi, whose ancestors were sealed off in the Americas for thousands of years prior? How does it explain the Australian myths, born from an even deeper isolation? Have you found the single historical truth? Or have you simply explained one echo in a room that is still, inexplicably, filled with them? The Black Sea Deluge theory is a beautiful piece of detective work. It gives you a time, a place, and a motive for the creation of the Mesopotamian flood myth, the story that would eventually echo down to us as the tale of Noah. But in doing so, it acts like a spotlight, illuminating this one corner of the mystery so brilliantly that the shadows in all the other corners, in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, only seem to grow deeper and darker. How can one regional event in 5600 BCE explain a global pattern? The answer, for many anthropologists and historians, is simple. The story didn't have to happen everywhere because the story traveled. This is the theory of cultural diffusion. You have to imagine ideas and narratives as living things. Like viruses of the mind, they can be contagious, spreading from person to person, from tribe to tribe, from culture to culture. A powerful story, one that taps into our deepest fears and hopes, is the most infectious agent of all. And the flood myth, a story of total destruction and miraculous survival, is a blockbuster. Let's imagine the scene. You are a refugee from the Black Sea flood. You and your people have been driven from your ancestral lands by the rising water. You settle in a new land, perhaps on the outskirts of one of the burgeoning city-states of Mesopotamia. What do you have left? You have your skills, your family, and your stories. And you have one story that is more powerful than all the others. The tale of how your entire world was drowned. You tell it to your new neighbors around a fire. They are captivated. It's a terrifying cautionary tale that resonates with their own experience of the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They adopt the story, weaving it into their own mythology, changing the names to match their own gods and heroes. Now you are a merchant in a Babylonian bazaar 1,000 years later. Your caravan is preparing for a long journey east, towards the Indus Valley. As part of your trade, you swap stories with other travelers. You tell them the grand epic of Utnapishtim. The story travels with you, and in the bustling cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, it finds fertile ground. It is retold, reshaped, and eventually becomes the Hindu story of Manu. At the same time, another merchant is loading his ship in a Phoenician port, bound for the Aegean. He carries the story with him, and in the trading posts of the Greek Isles, it is heard and adapted, eventually becoming the myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The story spreads following the great arteries of trade and migration that connected the ancient world of Afro-Eurasia. In our modern, literate world, you might be skeptical. You think of the game of telephone where a message becomes hopelessly garbled after just a few retellings. But this is a profound misunderstanding of the power and precision of formal oral tradition. Before writing, memory was a sacred tool, honed and trained with a rigor that is almost unimaginable to us today. You can see echoes of it in history. For thousands of years, the sacred Vedic hymns of India, comprising over 100,000 words, were preserved with perfect phonetic fidelity by Brahmin priests who were trained from childhood to be living repositories of the text. Polynesian navigators crossing thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes memorized epic chants that served as complex star charts and geographical maps. For these cultures, oral transmission was not a game of telephone. It was a high-fidelity recording technology. So you can easily picture this powerful flood narrative spreading across the connected land masses of Africa, Europe, and Asia, its core structure preserved by the formal mechanisms of oral storytelling. It's a neat, logical explanation for the myth's presence in the Old World. But the theory of diffusion, for all its power, eventually sails to the edge of the known world, where it is met with two insurmountable obstacles: the great oceans that isolate the Americas, and the 50,000 years of deep time that isolate Australia. There is no evidence of any sustained contact between the Old World and the New that could have transmitted a complex myth before the time of Columbus. There is absolutely no evidence of contact with the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. For the diffusion model to be the universal explanation, the story's transmission must have happened before these populations were cut off from the rest of the world. This means the flood myth must have been told and spread before the Bering Land Bridge was submerged by the rising seas of the Great Thaw, around 11,000 years ago. Suddenly, the timeline is thrown violently backward. The source cannot be the Black Sea Deluge of 5600 BCE. It must be an event, or at least a story, from the Deep Ice Age. This forces you to confront an almost paradoxical choice. Which is more unbelievable? That a complex six-part story, a specific narrative blueprint, could be passed down through the whispering chain of oral tradition for 15,000 years, carried by nomadic hunter-gatherers across every continent on Earth. Surviving language changes, cultural collapses, and the birth of civilization itself, or that dozens of completely isolated cultures all happen to invent the exact same, highly specific and detailed story by pure coincidence. The theory of diffusion doesn't solve the mystery. It simply forces you to choose between an impossible feat of memory and an impossible coincidence. You've reached a critical impasse. The theory of a psychological archetype explains the myth's power, but not its specific plot. The theory of local floods explains its prevalence, but not its uncanny similarity. The theory of ancient sea level rise explains its universality, but relies on an almost unbelievable feat of oral tradition. And the theory of diffusion just pushes the problem further back in time. Faced with this web of maybes, you are forced to return to the simplest, most brutal form of inquiry. It would have been the single most violent and transformative geological event in human history. An event of that magnitude must have left a scar on the body of the Earth itself. The investigation must now leave the library of myth and the laboratory of the mind and enter the courthouse of geology. We must ask the rocks for their testimony. You have to understand how the Earth keeps its diary. The history of our planet is written in layers of rock or strata. Every layer of sediment, mud, silt, sand, volcanic ash that is laid down, is a new page. Geologists can read these pages drilling deep into the Earth's crust or the ocean floor to pull up core samples that show these layers stacked one on top of the other, a vertical timeline stretching back millions of years. So what would you expect to find? If a single planet-wide flood occurred just a few thousand years ago, it would have left a single, undeniable page in that diary. You would expect to find a synchronous, universal layer of sediment. This flood layer would be present everywhere at the same point in the geological timeline. You'd find it in the mud at the bottom of Lake Baikal in Siberia, in the sediment off the coast of Antarctica, and in the soil profiles of the Amazon rainforest. This layer would be the smoking gun. It would be the physical, incontrovertible proof. And so, geologists have looked. They have drilled and dug and analyzed samples from every conceivable environment on the planet. And the testimony of the rocks is a deafening, unanimous, and absolute silence. There is no global flood layer. The geological record, the Earth's own diary, has no entry for such an event in the last 100,000 years. From the standpoint of mainstream science, this is the end of the conversation. The case is closed. The lack of physical evidence is the definitive proof that a literal worldwide flood did not happen in human history. But is the case ever truly closed in this line of investigation? You are now confronted by a radically different way of reading the evidence, a perspective that comes from the fringes of scientific thought. This is the argument of the catastrophists or flood geologists. They look at the conclusion of mainstream geology and say, "You're right, there is no thin layer of flood sediment. You've missed the point entirely. You're looking for a single page in the book when the flood is the book." It's the principle that the same slow, gradual processes we see happening today, erosion, sedimentation, volcanic activity, are responsible for creating all the geological features of the past. The present is the key to the past. Catastrophists reject this. They argue that Earth's history is not a slow, steady story, but one punctuated by sudden, violent, global upheavals. And the Great Flood, they claim, was the most recent and significant of them all. From their perspective, the evidence isn't missing. It's everywhere, hiding in plain sight. They argue that the entire fossil record is not a timeline of slow evolution over millions of years, but a snapshot of a single mass death event. The countless billions of fossils buried in sedimentary rock all over the world are the remains of the creatures that were drowned in the flood and buried rapidly in its muddy waters. Vast fossil graveyards, where dinosaurs, mammals, and marine creatures are found jumbled together, are not ancient riverbeds. They are places where the churning floodwaters dumped their victims. They point to anomalies that seem to challenge the slow and gradual model. You are shown, for example, a photograph of a polystrate fossil. It's a fossilized tree trunk, standing perfectly upright, penetrating through multiple layers, or strata, of rock. Mainstream geology says these rock layers represent many thousands of years of slow, gradual sediment accumulation. But how could a dead tree stand upright for thousands of years without rotting away while it was slowly buried? The catastrophists argue this is impossible. The only explanation, they say, is that all those layers were dumped at once, in a single, massive, watery event that buried the tree in an instant. The Grand Canyon? Not the result of millions of years of the Colorado River. It was carved in a matter of months by the catastrophic drainage of the receding floodwaters. You are now standing between two irreconcilable interpretations of the exact same evidence. Mainstream science says the lack of a single universal flood layer is proof the event never happened. Catastrophist geology says the existence of the entire geological column, and the fossil record within it, is proof that it did. It's a question of paradigm, of the lens through which you choose to view the world. So you are left with a critical, and perhaps unanswerable, question. Is the geological silence truly the final word, or is it possible that the evidence is so vast, so all-encompassing, that we are like a fish trying to understand the concept of wet? Could the very ground beneath our feet be the thing we are looking for, a single catastrophic layer so big that we mistake it for the whole of geological history? You are trapped in a geological paradox. Mainstream science presents a deafening silence where the evidence of a global flood should be. Fringe catastrophism claims the evidence is so massive we can't even see it. It's an impasse. But what if both are missing a crucial clue? What if the cataclysm wasn't a simple flood of rain from above or sea from below? What if the destruction came from a direction no one was looking? To find the next piece of this puzzle, you must lift your eyes from the rocks beneath your feet and turn them towards the cold, silent darkness of space. Your journey takes you back to a specific and very strange moment in our planet's history, the beginning of the Younger Dryas period, about 12,900 years ago. You find yourself in a world that is finally waking up from the long nightmare of the Ice Age. The great glaciers that covered North America and Europe are in full retreat. The climate is warming. Life is flourishing. Herds of woolly mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths graze on the vast plains. And among them, a successful and widespread culture of human hunters, known to us as the Clovis people, are thriving. It is a world of promise, a planet on the verge of a climatic spring. And then, in the geological blink of an eye, something goes terribly wrong. The warming trend doesn't just stop, it violently reverses. The temperature across the northern hemisphere plummets, plunging the planet back into conditions nearly as cold as the Ice Age. Glaciers that had been retreating suddenly begin to advance again. This sudden, brutal cold snap, the Younger Dryas, would last for the next 100-200 years. For decades, this event was one of the greatest mysteries in paleoclimatology. What could possibly have the power to derail a planet-wide warming trend so suddenly and completely? In 2007, a team of more than 24 scientists proposed a terrifying answer. They argued that the Younger Dryas was not caused by any terrestrial process. It was the result of a cosmic impact. But you must erase from your mind the image of a single asteroid striking the Earth and leaving a neat, tidy crater. Their hypothesis is far more complex and far more chaotic. They propose that the Earth passed through the debris trail of a large disintegrating comet. Thousands of fragments, some of them a kilometer wide, slammed into our atmosphere over North America, Europe, and Asia in a series of colossal airbursts and impacts. You have to try and imagine the scene on the ground. For the Clovis hunters standing on the plains of North America, the sky would have ignited. The airbursts would have unleashed the energy of thousands of nuclear weapons, creating a thermal pulse that would have incinerated millions of square miles of forest and grassland in an instant. This is not a metaphor. Archaeologists have found a black mat, a thin layer of carbon-rich soil dating to precisely this time, at dozens of sites across the continent. It is filled with soot, charcoal, and other evidence of continent-spanning wildfires. The primary target of this cosmic bombardment was the 2-mile-thick Laurentide ice sheet that still covered much of North America. The immense heat of the impacts and airbursts would have flash-melted a vast portion of the ice cap, releasing a volume of water that is almost impossible to comprehend. This was not a rising sea. This was a tidal wave of fresh, cold meltwater, a literal continental flood, roaring across the landscape, scouring it down to the bedrock, and pouring into the North Atlantic. This sudden, massive injection of cold, fresh water is the proposed kill mechanism for the climate. It would have shut down the great ocean currents that transport tropical heat to the north, effectively turning off the planet's circulatory system and plunging it into a deep freeze. Here, you have a theory that accounts for so many enduring mysteries at once: the sudden onset of the Younger Dryas Ice Age, the simultaneous extinction of 35 genera of North American megafauna, the mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant sloths, all gone in a flash, the mysterious disappearance of the Clovis culture, whose artifacts are found in abundance right up to the black mat layer, and then never again. And, most importantly for our investigation, you have a single global cataclysm that involves both fire from the sky and a world-drowning flood. It happened 12,800 years ago, a perfect time frame to serve as the single common ancestor for all the world's flood myths before the continents were fully isolated. The survivors would not have just told a story about water. They would have told a story about a world destroyed by fire and water, ordered by vengeful gods from the sky. The evidence for this impact is microscopic but compelling. Thin layers of exotic materials like nanodiamonds, melted glass spherules, and elevated concentrations of platinum and iridium, all found within that black mat layer, and all known markers of an extraterrestrial impact. And yet, the theory remains deeply controversial. Many geologists and archaeologists are not convinced. They argue the evidence can be explained by other means and that the hunt for impact markers has yielded inconsistent results. This leaves you with a critical and unsettling question, one that goes to the heart of how science works. If a genuine world-altering impact event happened in our recent geological past, why is the evidence so contested and ambiguous? Is it because the nature of the event, a fragmented comet leaving no single crater, is so complex that its fingerprints are simply hard to read, visible only to those who know how to look? Or is the human mind so captivated by epic narratives of destruction, so eager for a single, dramatic solution to multiple ancient mysteries, that we are seeing a pattern where none exists, weaving a spectacular story from a few disputed data points and a layer of ancient soot? The comet's shadow lingers. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis gives you a scientifically plausible, if controversial, mechanism for a global cataclysm 12,800 years ago. It provides the fire, the flood, and the sudden, brutal winter. It explains the disappearance of the megafauna and the Clovis people. You are left with the image of a world scoured clean, its most successful inhabitants erased from existence. But this raises a new and far more speculative question. What if the Clovis hunters were not the only advanced culture on Earth at that time? What if the legends of a golden age, of a magnificent civilization that existed before our own, are not metaphors, but memories? Memories of a world that was not just wiped clean, but truly and utterly lost. To follow this thread, you must travel to the source of the most potent of these legends. You find yourself not in the Ice Age, but in 4th century BCE Athens, in the shade of a portico, listening to the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, Plato. In his dialogues, the Timaeus and Critias, he tells a story that he insists is not a myth, but a true history passed down from the lawmaker Solon, who heard it from the priests of Egypt. It is the story of Atlantis. Plato describes a mighty empire, a naval power located on a continent-sized island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out in the Atlantic Ocean. He paints a picture of a society of incredible sophistication, a city built of concentric rings of land and water, connected by bridges and canals large enough for ships to sail through. He speaks of magnificent temples clad in precious metals, of advanced engineering, of a powerful military, and a society that ruled over parts of Europe and Africa. But this great civilization grew arrogant and corrupt. It waged an unjust war against an ancient, virtuous Athens, and so the gods, in their anger, turned against Atlantis. In a single terrible day and night of misfortune, the story goes, there were violent earthquakes and floods. The island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. Plato gives a specific time frame for this destruction, 9,000 years before the time of Solon. That places the event squarely in the middle of the 10th millennium BCE, right in the chaotic aftermath of the last ice age and the younger Dryas. For centuries, Plato's story was seen as a fable, a philosophical allegory about the ideal state and the corrupting influence of power. But what if it wasn't? This is the core of the Atlantis hypothesis, as it has been reimagined by modern alternative historians. The theory proposes that Plato's account is a genuine, if fragmented, historical memory of a real, highly advanced global civilization that was destroyed in a great cataclysm. In this telling, Atlantis was not just one island, but the heartland of a worldwide seafaring culture. A civilization of master navigators, astronomers, and engineers who had mapped the globe and established outposts and colonies all over the planet during the Ice Age, when lower sea levels made ocean travel easier. This mother culture, the theory goes, was the source of the sudden agricultural revolution, the builder of the earliest megalithic structures, and the keeper of a sophisticated legacy of knowledge. And what was the cataclysm that destroyed it? For proponents of this theory, the younger Dryas impact is the perfect culprit. You can see the pieces clicking into place. The comet strike of 12,800 years ago was the single day and night of misfortune. The resulting earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and the flash flooding from the melted ice caps were the mechanism of destruction that sank the Atlantean heartland. The mega tsunamis generated by the event would have wiped out its coastal colonies around the globe. But not everyone died. A few survivors, perhaps on ships at sea when the cataclysm struck, or in high-altitude colonies, were spared. These are the heroes of the flood myths. You must try to see the world through their eyes. They are the traumatized remnants of a sophisticated civilization, adrift in a world plunged into chaos. They wash ashore in places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Andes Mountains, where they encounter the local populations of primitive hunter-gatherer tribes. To these tribes, the survivors would have seemed like gods. They possessed incredible knowledge of agriculture, of architecture, of medicine, of the stars. They knew how to organize societies and build magnificent structures. They were the civilizer gods you find in so many myths: Viracocha in the Andes, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Osiris in Egypt. They were the culture bearers, the bringers of the seeds of civilization. And what is the first and most important story these survivors would have told the primitive peoples they encountered? They would have told their own story. The story of their beautiful, advanced world. The story of the fire and floods that destroyed it. The story of their own miraculous escape in a vessel. The story of how they saved the seeds of their knowledge to restart civilization in a new land. This story, their own true history, becomes the Ur myth. Passed down through thousands of years by the indigenous peoples, this factual account is slowly warped by the lens of mythology. The advanced technology becomes magic, the leaders become gods, and the historical account of the end of the Ice Age world becomes the Great Flood myth. This grand unified theory of a lost civilization is intoxicating. It seems to solve everything at once. The origin of the flood myths, the mystery of the sudden rise of agriculture and civilization, the uncanny astronomical alignments of ancient monuments. It transforms the hundreds of disconnected global myths into a single coherent family tree, all descended from one true historical event. But it is a theory built on a foundation of pure absence. There are no Atlantean ruins on the ocean floor. No undisputed Atlantean artifacts have ever been found. There are no Atlantean skeletons. It is a spectacular and elegant edifice built entirely out of circumstantial evidence and mythological interpretation. So you are left with a final, disquieting question. At what point does the act of connecting these ancient dots stop being an investigation and start becoming the creation of a new modern myth? The theory of a lost civilization like Atlantis is a grand and sweeping narrative. It provides the who for our mystery, the survivors who allegedly carried the story of the flood to the primitive corners of the earth. It provides the what, the legacy of knowledge they brought with them. But it leaves you with a vague and unsatisfying how. Plato speaks of violent earthquakes and floods, a description that could fit any number of disasters. The younger Dryas comet provides one possible trigger. But some researchers have looked for a cause not in the chaos of space, but in a chaotic process within the Earth itself, a mechanism so violent and so contrary to modern scientific doctrine that it remains on the absolute fringes of possibility. To understand this idea, you first have to picture the Earth as you were taught it in school. The surface is a jigsaw puzzle of tectonic plates, and these massive continents are drifting, but at a glacial, almost imperceptible pace. They move at about the same speed your fingernails grow. This is the world of plate tectonics, a slow, steady, and predictable process that plays out over hundreds of millions of years. But what if this isn't the only way the Earth's surface can move? What if on rare occasions it can move all at once? You are now entering the world of Charles Hapgood. He was not a geologist but a historian and college professor who in the 1950s became obsessed with anomalies. Ancient maps that seemed to show Antarctica without ice-woolly mammoths found flash-frozen in Siberia, with undigested summer flowers in their stomachs. He sought a single theory that could explain it all. The result was his 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust, and the theory of Earth crust displacement. The idea is as simple as it is terrifying. Imagine the Earth is an orange. The fleshy fruit inside is the planet's molten interior, the mantle. The peel is the solid outer crust, the lithosphere, which is about 30 to 60 miles thick. Hapgood's theory proposes that, under certain conditions, the entire peel can detach and slip in one piece over the soft, semi-liquid layer of the upper mantle beneath it. This is not plate tectonics, where individual pieces of the puzzle drift apart. This is the whole puzzle sliding at once. What could cause such a thing? Hapgood theorized that the immense weight of the polar ice caps, built up unevenly during an ice age, could eventually cause the Earth's crust to become unbalanced. Like a spinning top with a piece of clay stuck to its side, the centrifugal force would create a wobble that would put unbearable stress on the connection between the crust and the mantle. Eventually, a tipping point is reached. The crust breaks loose and lurches, sliding over the interior until the weight of the ice caps is redistributed closer to the equator. A continent like Antarctica could be shifted thousands of miles, moving from a temperate zone to its current position at the South Pole in a matter of days or weeks. The consequences of such an event are difficult to overstate. It would be the ultimate cataclysm. As the crust shifts, the entire globe would be racked by earthquakes beyond any measurable scale and volcanic eruptions on every continent. But the most significant effect would be on the oceans. The planet's seas, continuing to move by their own momentum, would slosh out of their basins, creating global mega-tsunamis thousands of feet high. These waves would sweep across entire continents, wiping the slate of life completely clean. This is not a local flood. This is not a slowly rising sea. This is a planetary scouring, a world-drowning event that fits the most extreme descriptions in the ancient myths. This theory sounds like pure science fiction, and indeed modern geophysics, with its sophisticated understanding of the forces that bind the crust to the mantle, has largely dismissed Hapgood's mechanism as physically impossible. And yet, the theory has a strange and compelling footnote. The original foreword to Hapgood's book was written by none other than Albert Einstein. While Einstein did not fully endorse the theory, he was intrigued by its audacity. He wrote, "I frequently receive communications from people who wish to consult me concerning their unpublished ideas. It goes without saying that these ideas are very seldom possessed of scientific validity. The very first communication, however, that I received from Mr. Hapgood electrified me. His idea is original, of great simplicity, and, if it continues to prove itself, of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface. Hapgood's theory provides a single, elegant, if terrifying mechanism for nearly every mystery we've discussed. It provides the flood of all floods. It explains how a temperate, inhabited continent, an Atlantis perhaps, could be moved to the South Pole and flash frozen under miles of ice. It explains the sudden end of the Ice Age and the mass extinctions. It is the ultimate catastrophist fantasy. This brings you to a difficult crossroads in our investigation, a place where the history of science itself is in question. Hapgood's theory was developed before the model of plate tectonics became the ruling paradigm. Does our current model, which has explained so much, preclude the possibility of a rarer, more violent process? Or are we in danger of the same kind of dogmatism that caused the scientific establishment to ridicule the theory of continental drift for 50 years before it was finally proven correct? Is Earth crust displacement a failed hypothesis from a bygone era? Or is it a chilling radical possibility that we have dismissed simply because our current scientific narrative has no room for a world that can be turned upside down in the blink of a geological eye? You have followed this mystery to the very edge of geology and into the heart of a planetary catastrophe. The theory of Earth crust displacement, like the Younger Dryas impact, provides a potential physical mechanism for a world-ending flood. But both of these theories, for all their destructive power, struggle with one key element of the mythical blueprint, the element of intelligent, divine intervention. In story after story, the flood is not just a random disaster. It is a plan. There is a warning, a chosen hero, a specific design for a survival vessel. These are not the hallmarks of a natural catastrophe. They are the hallmarks of a deliberate operation. This forces you to ask a question that takes our investigation out of the realm of geology and climatology entirely, and into the farthest reaches of speculative thought. What if the gods of the myths were not meteorological metaphors or psychological archetypes? What if they were real, physical beings? And what if their home was not a metaphysical heaven but a physical place among the stars? You are now entering the domain of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. The core premise of this theory is a radical reframing of all human history. It posits that in our remote past, our planet was visited by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization. These beings, with their starships, their energy weapons, and their mastery of genetic engineering, were so far beyond the comprehension of early humans that they were worshipped as gods. Our myths, therefore, are not myths at all. They are the distorted cargo cult memories of our ancestors' encounters with these powerful, flesh and blood visitors from another world. Now you must pick up the ancient texts of the flood, Genesis, Gilgamesh, and read them again, not as sacred scripture, but as a corrupted historical log of a technological event. Look at the Mesopotamian version. The decision to destroy humanity is made in a divine council of the Anunnaki gods. In this new reading, this is not a gathering in some celestial palace. This is a board meeting in a command center, perhaps on an orbiting mothership. The debate between the god Enlil, who wants humanity destroyed, and the god Ea, who wants to save a portion of it, is not a theological dispute. It is a political or ethical conflict between two factions of these extraterrestrial colonizers about how to manage their human experiment. Look at the strange, cryptic verses in Genesis chapter 6 that serve as the direct prelude to the flood. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. The text goes on to speak of giants, the Nephilim, who were born from these unions. From a theological standpoint, it's a bizarre and difficult passage, but through the lens of this theory it becomes a clear narrative. The sons of God are the extraterrestrial visitors. Their interbreeding with humanity is an unauthorized contamination of the genetic project. The flood in this context becomes a necessary and brutal reset, a way to wipe the slate clean and start the experiment over. But how is it done? If the gods were technologists, then the flood was a piece of planetary engineering. You can imagine several scenarios. Perhaps the flood was a weapon. An advanced civilization could easily steer a comet or asteroid to strike the polar ice caps, triggering the exact kind of cataclysm described in the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Or they could have employed massive-scale weather modification technology, inducing a deluge of unimaginable proportions. The flood was not an act of God. It was a controlled demolition. Alternatively, you could see it as a rescue mission. Perhaps the cataclysm was a natural event, the approaching comet, for instance, that the gods, with their advanced astronomical knowledge, could see coming. In this version, a benevolent faction decides to intervene to preserve the crowning achievement of their genetic work. The warning to Noah or Utnapishtim is not a divine whisper. It is an intelligence briefing. The hero is a chosen human contactee. And the Ark is no longer a simple wooden boat. How could a primitive vessel survive a world-drowning cataclysm? How could one family possibly care for thousands of animal pairs? In this rereading, the Ark is a piece of advanced technology. Perhaps it was a submarine, a submersible biosphere capable of riding out the disaster deep beneath the waves. Or perhaps the mission was not to save the animals themselves, but their genetic code. The instruction to gather the seed of all living things becomes literal. The Ark is a genetic laboratory, a DNA ark, carrying cryogenically preserved embryos or a vast digital database of the planetary genome, ready to reseed the Earth once the waters receded. This theory, as wild as it sounds, provides a stunningly literal explanation for the most mysterious parts of the myth: the foreknowledge, the specific and complex instructions, the miraculous survival. But it pushes you to a philosophical precipice. Which is the greater act of arrogance? To look upon the sacred stories of our ancestors, the texts that have guided civilizations for millennia, and dismiss them as the primitive, superstitious fantasies of people who simply didn't understand how lightning works? Or to take our ancestors at their word, to accept the possibility that they were doing their best to describe real events, real encounters with beings of incomprehensible power and technology, and that we are the ones who are too blinded by the dogmas of our own era to see it? Are you reading a myth, or are you reading a history book whose language you have forgotten how to speak? The ancient astronaut hypothesis is a dizzying detour into science fiction, recasting gods as extraterrestrials and sacred texts as technological logs. It provides a source for the intelligent intervention so central to the flood myths. But now, you must pull back from the cosmos and return to the foundational text of the Western flood tradition, the Book of Genesis, and confront the same question from a completely different perspective. If the beings involved were not aliens, but the singular, omnipotent God of the Bible, you are still left with a profound physical problem. Where did all the water come from? To take the story of Noah literally is to believe in a flood that covered the highest mountains on Earth. You have to picture Mount Everest, over 29,000 feet high, completely submerged. The amount of water required for such a deluge is staggering, far more than exists in all the world's rivers, lakes, and atmosphere combined. The text mentions the fountains of the great deep bursting forth, which can account for subterranean and oceanic sources. But it also speaks of another source, the windows of heaven being opened. For 40 days and 40 nights it rained. What was the source of this celestial ocean? This question has led proponents of a literal interpretation to formulate one of the most imaginative and elaborate theories in the entire landscape of this mystery. It is a model of a lost, antediluvian world that is utterly alien to our own. It is known as the vapor canopy theory. To understand it, you have to go back to the second day of creation as described in Genesis chapter 1. You read the verse, "And God said, 'Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. The theory takes this passage with absolute literalness. Before the flood, it proposes there was a vast, thick layer of water, in the form of vapor, suspended high in the Earth's upper atmosphere, held in place by God's will. This was the waters from above. The existence of this canopy, you are told, would have created a pre-flood world that is almost unrecognizable to us. The canopy would have acted like the glass of a planetary greenhouse, creating a uniformly warm, tropical climate across the entire globe, from the equator to the poles. There would be no seasons, no weather as we know it, and no polar ice caps. The weight of this water vapor would have also significantly increased the atmospheric pressure at the surface, creating a hyperbaric environment that, proponents argue, would have had dramatic biological effects. Furthermore, this layer of water would have acted as a powerful shield, blocking much of the harmful cosmic and ultraviolet radiation that now bombards our planet. You are asked to envision this world, a lush, misty, hyper-oxygenated paradise. And this paradise, the theory claims, is the scientific explanation for the incredible lifespans of the biblical patriarchs. Adam, Seth, Methuselah, they lived for over 900 years not because of a miracle but because they existed in this protected, life-enhancing environment. It was this world, free from the degenerative effects of solar radiation and filled with a different kind of air, that allowed for such longevity. Then came the flood. The mechanism that triggered it is debated, perhaps a meteor strike, perhaps a divine command, but the result was the catastrophic collapse of the canopy. The windows of heaven were opened, and the waters held in the upper atmosphere fell to the earth as a continuous, globe-encompassing torrential rain for 40 days and 40 nights. This is the source of the biblical deluge. The collapse of the canopy didn't just cause the flood. It permanently and irrevocably changed the planet. When the waters receded, the protective shield was gone. The Earth was now exposed to the harsh realities of space. Harmful radiation streamed in, and human lifespans, you see, begin to drop precipitously in the generations after Noah. The uniform global climate collapsed, giving rise to the seasons, to weather patterns, to storms, and to the formation of the polar ice caps. And in this new post-canopy atmosphere, something could happen for the very first time. Sunlight, passing through water droplets suspended in the air after a storm, could create a rainbow. The rainbow, the symbol of God's promise never again to flood the earth, was not just a symbol. It was a new physical phenomenon, possible only in the transformed, post-flood world. From a narrative standpoint, it is a work of genius. It is a complete self-contained and internally consistent system that uses one single premise, the canopy, to explain the pre-flood paradise, the long lifespans, the mechanism of the flood, the subsequent decline in longevity, and the origin of the rainbow. But from a scientific standpoint, the theory collapses under its own weight. Physicists and climatologists have pointed out fatal flaws. Condensing that much water vapor into rain would release a cataclysmic amount of heat, boiling the oceans and poaching everything on the planet, including the occupants of the Ark. A canopy, thick enough to hold the required water, would also be opaque, blocking the sunlight needed for life to exist on the surface. This leads you to a fascinating question that isn't about physics, but about human psychology. The vapor canopy theory is a powerful and compelling story, but it is not a scientifically viable model. So why does it endure? Does the profound appeal of such a comprehensive, all-in-one explanation, even in the face of overwhelming scientific refutation, tell us more about the evidence or about ourselves? Does it speak to a deep human need for narratives that create order out of chaos, that tie up all the loose ends, and that make a mysterious and complicated world feel simple, purposeful, and divinely authored? You have journeyed from the solid ground of geology to the outer fringes of astrophysics and into the strange territory of alien intervention and creationist physics. Each theory provides a potential answer, yet each one opens a new set of questions. The investigation has looked for a cause on the Earth, under the Earth, and in the space beyond it. But now you must consider a possibility that is at once more abstract and more intimate. What if the story of the flood is not a record of a physical event, but a grand metaphor written in the one book that was open to every single ancient culture on the planet, the silent, glittering page of the night sky. To understand this, you must first try to see the sky as your ancestors saw it. For you, it is a backdrop, a distant and largely irrelevant canvas, its light washed out by the glow of your cities. For them, it was everything. The sky was their clock, their calendar, and their compass. The slow, majestic march of the constellations told them when to plant and when to harvest. The position of the sun and moon governed their festivals and their sacred rites. The movements of the planets were omens, messages from the gods that determined the fate of kings and empires. Ancient civilizations, especially the Mesopotamians who gave us our first written flood myth, were not casual stargazers. They were master astronomers, and the sky was the central pillar of their worldview. When you look up with their eyes, you begin to see pieces of the flood story scattered among the stars. You can see the constellation Aquarius, the celestial water-bearer, whose appearance in the sky once coincided with the rainy season and the annual flooding of the rivers in the Near East. You can trace the outline of the former constellation Argo Navis, the great ship, a sprawling collection of stars in the southern sky that the Greeks associated with the vessel of Jason and the Argonauts. Many mythologists believe it is a much older image, a celestial echo of the ark itself. But these are just scattered clues. The full theory is far more profound. It suggests the flood myth is not about a constellation, but about a cosmic cycle so vast it is almost beyond our comprehension. This is the cycle known as the precession of the equinoxes. You have to picture the Earth as a spinning top. As it spins on its axis, it also has a slow, almost imperceptible wobble. Because of this wobble, the spot in the sky where the sun rises on the first day of spring, the vernal equinox, is not fixed. It slowly drifts backwards through the 12 constellations of the zodiac. This drift is incredibly slow. It takes about 2,160 years for the equinox to cross one zodiacal constellation, a period we call a great month, or an astrological age. To complete one full wobble, one full cycle through all 12 constellations, takes nearly 26,000 years. This is the Great Year. According to this astronomical theory, many of our most powerful and enduring myths are not stories about terrestrial events. They are complex allegories designed to encode and transmit sophisticated astronomical knowledge about this very cycle of precession. The Great Flood in this reading is a universal metaphor for the transition from one world age to the next. As the sun's position on the equinox precesses out of one constellation, say the age of Gemini, and into the next, the age of Taurus, the entire cosmic order is overturned. The celestial house that governed the world for over 2,000 years is symbolically drowned in the waters of time, and a new world, a new cosmic order, is born. The flood myth becomes a celestial parable. The world that is destroyed is not the physical earth, but the old paradigm, the old age. The divine anger is not about human sin, but a metaphor for the inexorable cosmic forces that drive the cycle forward. The hero who survives in the ark is the keeper of sacred knowledge, the figure who carries the wisdom of the dying age across the waters of transition and into the dawning of the new one. The story is a grand cosmic clock, a way of marking the passage of the great year. The myth's universality is explained not because everyone saw a flood, but because everyone saw the same sky and the same slow, majestic, and world-altering celestial shift. This is a powerful and intellectually seductive idea. It credits our ancestors with a profound and subtle astronomical knowledge that we are only now beginning to rediscover. But you must ask a critical question. Is it plausible that a story so filled with raw physical and emotional detail, the terror of drowning the cry of a starving raven, the joy of stepping onto solid muddy ground, is nothing more than a bloodless allegory for a slow-moving astronomical cycle? The agony of the myth feels intensely personal and deeply terrestrial. The trauma seems real. This leads you to a final, more nuanced possibility. Perhaps it's not an either-or question. Perhaps our ancestors, grappling with the real, terrifying, and chaotic memory of a world-shattering flood, turned to the one thing in their lives that was orderly, eternal, and predictable. The grand cycles of the stars. Perhaps they used the language of the heavens to tell the story of a terrestrial hell. The astronomical allegory was not a substitute for the real event, but a framework, a celestial map onto which they projected their own traumatic history, giving it a sense of cosmic meaning and ensuring that a memory this important would be forever written in the stars. We have chased the flood myth across the globe and through the deepest corridors of time. We've treated it as a history to be verified, a geological event to be located, a psychological archetype to be decoded, and a celestial allegory to be translated. We have looked at this story from every angle except the most important one. We have forgotten to look at it through the eyes of the survivor. You must now try to put yourself in their place. The journey is over. The vessel has come to rest on the muddy peak of a desolate mountain. The door opens for the first time in months, and you step out. You are not stepping into a fresh, clean, new world. You are stepping into a graveyard. The world is silent. There are no birds, no animals, no human voices. There is only the gray sky, the endless mud, and the profound soul-crushing stench of decay. Everything and everyone you have ever known, your friends, your neighbors, your entire society, is gone, buried beneath the silt. You are utterly and completely alone. The overwhelming emotion is not joy or relief. It is horror, guilt, and a grief so vast it has no name. This is the ground zero of the flood myth. It is a story born not of wonder or curiosity, but of trauma. In the last century, we have learned a great deal about how the human mind processes events that are too horrific to comprehend. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder, when a person endures something that shatters their sense of safety and their understanding of the world. The memory of that event doesn't get filed away like a normal memory. It gets stuck. It remains raw, present, and intrusive. The survivor is haunted by flashbacks, by nightmares, by a constant looping replay of the worst moments. And one of the most common and most necessary responses to trauma is the compulsion to tell the story over and over again in an attempt to master it, to give it a narrative structure, to turn an overwhelming chaotic experience into a memory that can finally be put to rest. Now you must take this model of individual trauma and scale it up to the size of a whole culture. What happens when the survivor is not one person, but an entire people? The result is what sociologists call cultural trauma. An event occurs that is so catastrophic it tears the very fabric of a society's meaning. The wound is not to an individual psyche, but to the collective soul. And just like an individual, the society must find a way to process the memory. It does so by creating a story. The flood myth, from this perspective, is not a history. It is a scar. You can see the symptoms of this trauma encoded in the very blueprint of the myth that we have been tracing. Think about the first and most common element, the divine cause. Why in almost every version is the flood a deliberate act of divine punishment? This is a classic trauma response. For the human mind, the most terrifying thing is not suffering, it's meaningless suffering. To believe that your world was destroyed for no reason at all by a blind and indifferent universe is a horror too great to bear. But if you can believe it happened for a reason, that your people had become sinful, that the gods were angry, then you impose a moral order onto the chaos. It's a terrible order, but it's better than no order at all. It gives the event a meaning. Then you have the chosen hero. Why is there always a single family, a righteous man who is singled out to survive? You are looking at a profound psychological defense against the unbearable weight of survivors' guilt. The people telling this story are the descendants of the few who lived while everyone else died. To believe that their ancestors survived by pure random chance is to accept a terrible burden. But if you believe your ancestor was specifically chosen for his virtue, that he was saved for a divine purpose, then you transform the guilt of survival into a heroic destiny. You are not the children of the lucky, you are the children of the chosen. The story itself, told and retold for 1,000 generations, becomes a form of ritualized cultural flashback. It is the society's way of reenacting its foundational trauma in a safe and structured way. And finally, you have the covenant, the divine promise, sealed with a rainbow, that this will never happen again. This is the ultimate expression of the survivor's deepest need, the need for a guarantee of safety. It is the desperate prayer that the horror will not return, transformed into a sacred promise from the gods themselves. From this vantage point, the flood myth is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a testament to be witnessed. It is the story of a people grappling with an existential wound, struggling to make sense of the senseless. It is a monument, built of words, to an entire world that was lost. Its power and its universality come not from its geological accuracy, but from its profound psychological honesty. This reframes your entire investigation. If the flood myth is, at its core, a story about trauma, then perhaps you've been asking the wrong questions all along. We've been searching for evidence of the flood, but maybe we should have been looking for the evidence of the wound it left behind. Is it possible that the truth of this ancient story has nothing to do with sediment layers or comet fragments or celestial cycles? Is the real truth of the myth found in its unflinching depiction of the human spirit, its capacity to endure the unimaginable, and its incredible power to transform the memory of its greatest trauma into a sacred story of survival, meaning, and rebirth? To view the flood myth as a trauma narrative is to change the very nature of your investigation. You are no longer searching for a crime scene, but for the meaning of a scar. The story ceases to be a literal history of a physical event and becomes a sacred text, a spiritual and psychological map of a culture's journey through death and rebirth. If this is true, then every element of the story is supercharged with meaning. The ark is not just a boat. The animals are not just cargo. The mountain is not just a high piece of ground. They are all symbols in a profound and ancient language, and to understand the myth's power, you must learn to speak it. You begin with the agent of destruction itself, the water. In the great myths, the flood does not just come from one direction. The windows of heaven open and the fountains of the great deep burst forth. This is symbolically crucial. It is the complete dissolution of the created world. In virtually all creation myths, the first act is one of separation, separating the light from the dark, the land from the sea, and most importantly, the waters above from the waters below. This is what creates an ordered cosmos, a world in which we can live. The flood is the terrifying reversal of this process. The boundaries are erased. The sky collapses into the sea. It is a return to the primordial, chaotic, undifferentiated ocean from which the world was first born. It is the ultimate UN creation. Into this swirling chaos, a single point of order is introduced: the ark. You must see this vessel as more than a physical object. The ark is a microcosm, a self-contained, ordered world floating upon the boundless chaos. Outside its walls is the death of everything. Inside is the carefully curated seed of all future life. The ark is a geometric constructed object. Its dimensions are often given with divine precision, and this represents the power of intellect and order to create a sanctuary in the midst of nature's indiscriminate fury. It is a floating island of meaning. You can also see it as a symbol of the womb. It is a dark, sealed, life-preserving container, floating on the cosmic waters for a period of gestation. All life on Earth enters it, undergoes a symbolic death as the old world is destroyed, and then emerges, reborn, into a new one. The story of the flood is the story of the death and rebirth of the entire world, and the ark is the great planetary womb that makes this rebirth possible. Now you must look at the passengers. The hero, Noah, Utnapishtim, Manu, is the conscious organizing principle. He is the human will that receives the divine plan and enacts it. His family represents the seed of human society, the social order that must be preserved. But the animals are perhaps the most profound symbol of all. On a literal level, this is an act of ecological preservation. But on a symbolic level, the animals represent the full spectrum of our own inner instinctual life. They are our own untamed, non-rational selves, the courage of the lion, the cunning of the serpent, the soaring spirit of the eagle, the quiet patience of the ox. The mission of the hero is not just to save his rational human self, but to save his whole self. He must build a vessel in his consciousness large enough to contain and honor all these primal energies, to carry them safely through the crisis, so that the new world and the new self can be whole, and complete. After the long journey, the chaos subsides, and the ark comes to rest on the mountain. The mountain is the first piece of solid ground to emerge from the limitless ocean. It is a symbol of stability, certainty, and the return of order. But it is more than that. In the study of comparative mythology, the sacred mountain is a universal symbol known as the axis mundi, the world's navel, the cosmic center. It is the place where the heavens, the earth, and the underworld meet. It is the natural altar, the point of connection between the human and the divine. And it is from this sacred central point that the new world can be founded, consecrated by a sacrifice and blessed by a covenant. And that covenant is sealed with the rainbow, a radiant, ephemeral bridge of light that connects the sky and the earth. It is a symbol of peace and reconciliation between the divine and the human, a promise that the boundary between the waters above and the waters below will once again be held firm. It is the perfect, final symbol for the end of a trauma narrative, a sign that the chaos has been resolved into a new, more beautiful, and more meaningful order. You are left with a story that is not a simple history, but a rich, multi-layered spiritual allegory about the eternal cycle of order, chaos, and rebirth. But this symbolic depth creates a final, fascinating paradox. Does the fact that the myth is encoded with these profound, universal symbols make it more or less likely to be based on a real event? Is it possible that the only event capable of activating all of these deep, primordial symbols in the human psyche at once is a genuine, world-shattering catastrophe? Perhaps a real flood is the only thing profound enough to force us to tell a story about ourselves that is simultaneously a literal memory of a drowned world and a timeless, symbolic map of the soul's journey through darkness and back into the light. After a journey into the deep symbolic heart of the flood myth, seeing the ark as a womb, the mountain as a cosmic center, the entire story as a map of the soul, you find yourself at a crossroads. The path of your investigation, which has twisted and turned through so many strange landscapes, has now come to a clear and final fork. The two paths ahead represent two fundamentally different ways of seeking truth, and the choice between them goes to the very heart of this entire mystery. It is a fork in the river, and to proceed you must understand the nature of the currents that have brought you here. On one side you have the path of the event. This is the path of the literalist, the historian, the scientist. It is a path paved with a demand for physical evidence. It seeks a specific time on a geological calendar, a specific place on a map, a specific, verifiable cause. This path insists that for the myth to be true, it must correspond to a single, factual, historical occurrence. This is the path that has sent you searching for a universal flood layer in the geological record. It's what led you to the shores of the Black Sea around 5600 BCE, and into the cosmic chaos of the Younger Dryas impact 12,800 years ago. This path asks the question, what happened? On the other side, you have the path of the meaning. This is the path of the mythologist, the psychologist, the poet. This path is unconcerned with physical evidence. It doesn't matter if a single drop of floodwater ever fell. It insists that the myth's truth lies in its timeless power, its psychological resonance, and its symbolic depth. This is the path that led you into the collective unconscious with Carl Jung, into the survivor's mind with trauma theory, and into the grand celestial cycles of the night sky. This path doesn't ask what happened. It asks, why do we tell this story, and what does it tell us about ourselves? For most of this investigation, you have been trying to force these two paths to merge. You have been trying to find a single event that could explain the myth's universal meaning. But the ancient Greeks had a language for this very dilemma. They understood that humans possess two complementary ways of knowing the world, two modes of truth, logos and mythos. Logos is the truth of reason, logic, and fact. It is the language of science, the world of verifiable propositions and empirical evidence. It is the mode of thinking that analyzes, categorizes, and explains. Logos seeks to understand how the world works. Your entire search for a geological cause, for a historical timeline, for a physical arc, has been a quest for logos. Mythos, on the other hand, is the truth of story, symbol, and meaning. It is the language of art, poetry, and religion. It is not concerned with factual accuracy, but with purpose, value, and the human condition. Mythos doesn't tell you how the world works, it tells you what the world means. Your exploration of the Ark as a symbol of rebirth, of the flood as a trauma narrative, has been a journey into the world of mythos. The ancient world understood that you needed both logos and mythos to have a complete picture of reality. They were not in competition. They were two sides of the same human consciousness. But your modern mind has been trained to see a hierarchy. We live in an age of logos. We have been taught that the only real truth is factual truth. We feel an intellectual duty to debunk mythos, to prove that a story is just a myth if it cannot be verified by science. This is the source of the conflict you feel now. You want to solve the case, to declare one theory the winner, to file the flood myth away in a box labeled either fact or fiction. But what if that is the wrong approach entirely? What if the Great Flood myth is the ultimate meeting point of these two ways of knowing? You are forced to confront a final, critical question that could resolve this entire conflict. Must you choose between these two paths? Is it not possible for the flood myth to be a story where logos and mythos are completely and inextricably intertwined? Think of it this way. A real, physical event of unimaginable horror, a comet strike, a crustal shift, a catastrophic deluge, occurs in our deep past. That is the logos. That is the fact, the anchor in reality. But an event of that magnitude is too large, too traumatic, too existentially terrifying to be recorded as a simple historical fact. It can only be processed, remembered, and passed down through the powerful, symbolic, and emotionally resonant language of mythos. Perhaps the story needed a factual seed to be born, and it needed a symbolic meaning to survive. The logos of the event is the body, but the mythos of the story is its immortal soul. Can you, as a modern investigator, learn to hold both of these truths at once? Can you accept that this story might be a true memory of what once happened to the world, and at the same time a timeless testament to what is always happening within the human heart? You have reached the end of this long and winding river of inquiry, a point where the waters of the past seem to flow directly into the ocean of the present. We have debated whether the Great Flood myth is logos or mythos, a literal fact or a symbolic truth. But perhaps the ultimate test of a story's power is whether it can be both, whether its ancient symbolic meaning can suddenly become terrifyingly literal once again. You must now step away from the ancient texts and the geological charts and look around at the world you live in here today. You look at the satellite images of the polar ice caps. You read the daily news reports, and you realize with a sudden and profound chill that the waters are rising again. The flood is no longer a myth. It is a forecast. You listen to the calm, measured voices of our modern prophets, the thousands of climate scientists who have been sending us warnings for decades. They speak of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets destabilizing, of thermal expansion of the oceans, of atmospheric carbon reaching levels not seen in 3 million years. They give us their predictions in the dispassionate language of logos, centimeters and meters of sea level rise, degrees of temperature increase, probabilities of extreme weather events. You see their warnings manifest in real time. The island nations of the Pacific, like Kiribati and the Maldives, are already planning for their own disappearance. Great coastal cities, Venice, Miami, New Orleans, Jakarta, Shanghai, are fighting desperate multi-billion-dollar battles with the encroaching sea, building seawalls and flood barriers that they know are only temporary. The flood is already here. It is a slow-motion cataclysm, a deluge unfolding over a century rather than 40 days. But it is a deluge nonetheless. And as you watch it happen, you cannot help but hear the echoes of the ancient stories. You are forced to see that the Great Flood myth is not just a story about the past. It is a timeless cautionary tale, and we are its newest and most heedless audience. Think back to the reasons the myths give for the flood. In the Genesis account, God looks upon the earth and sees that it is filled with violence and corruption. In the Greek story of Deucalion, Zeus is disgusted by humanity's hubris, cruelty, and greed. In the most ancient Mesopotamian version, the Epic of Atra Hasis, the reason is even more haunting. Humanity was simply too noisy. Our endless clamor was disturbing the sleep of the gods. Now, hold these ancient diagnoses up as a mirror to our own time. Do you not see the reflection? The violence of a global industrial system that rips resources from the earth with no thought for the consequences. The hubris of a civilization that believes it has conquered nature and can endlessly defy its limits. And the noise, the literal deafening, planet-altering roar of our 8 billion lives, our engines, our factories, our endless consumption, a clamor so great that it is fundamentally changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and the oceans. The ancient myths feel less like legends and more like an unnervingly accurate psychological profile of our own civilization. We have become the arrogant, heedless generation that ignored the warnings. And like the heroes of the myths, we too are beginning to think about how to build an ark. Our ark is not made of gopher wood and pitch. It is a vessel of technology and policy. You see it in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, a frozen repository drilled deep into an Arctic mountain, designed to preserve the genetic legacy of the world's crops, a literal ark of seeds, in case of a global catastrophe. You see it in the desperate plans for geoengineering, for gigantic seawalls, for floating cities. We are, in our own frantic modern way, listening to the warning and trying to construct a vessel that can carry some part of our world through the coming storm. But this is where the parallel becomes truly terrifying. The ancient myths, for all their horror, are ultimately stories of hope. They end with a small band of survivors on a mountaintop, given a divine promise and a second chance to build a new and better world. They are stories of a successful reboot. But as you look at our complex, fragile, and deeply interconnected global civilization, you must ask the hardest question of all. Is such a reboot even possible for us? The world of Noah was a world of scattered, independent tribes. The survival of one family meant the survival of humanity. But your world is a single planetary entity. 8 billion people are dependent on a delicate, intricate web of global supply chains, satellite communications, and a constant, uninterrupted flow of electricity. We are more powerful than our ancestors could have ever dreamed, but we are also infinitely more fragile. If a true global cataclysm were to strike now, a rapid climate shift, a collapse of the ocean currents, a sudden and catastrophic sea level rise, what would survival look like? Is there any ark big enough to save us? Is there any mountain high enough to serve as a refuge? Or has our greatest achievement, our global interconnectedness, become our greatest vulnerability? A guarantee that, unlike the people in the ancient stories, if our world goes down, we all go down together. The myth has ceased to be a story about the past. It has become a direct and urgent question about our future. And so your long journey through the drowned worlds of the past brings you back to the shore of the present. You have sailed the rivers of myth and the oceans of geological time. You have listened to the testimony of clay tablets, of ancient stones, of the human psyche, and of the stars themselves. Your final task is to stand back from the vast and cluttered map of your investigation, look at all the contradictory evidence you have gathered, and try to find a pattern in the chaos. What have you truly discovered? The evidence has led you not to a single clear answer, but to the shores of two great rival continents of thought. On one continent is the belief that the flood myth is a shared memory. This is the conviction that the hundreds of stories are all echoes of a single, real, global cataclysm. The evidence for this is the uncanny, fingerprint-like similarity of the narrative blueprint we uncovered. A story this specific, this detailed, repeated by isolated cultures, seems to defy the laws of coincidence. This continent of thought is supported by plausible, world-altering events that we know happened. You see the slow, inexorable flood of the Great Thaw at the end of the Ice Age, a process that drowned the coastlines of every people on Earth. You see the sudden, violent cataclysm of the Younger Dryas impact, a candidate for a true end-of-the-world event involving both fire and water. To explain how this memory was preserved and transmitted, you have the speculative but compelling stories of a lost advanced civilization, or the intervention of ancient astronauts providing the ark of knowledge that carried the story into our historical age. This path offers a grand, unified theory, a thrilling story of a real lost world. Its weakness is the lack of direct, undisputed physical proof. It is a continent built on circumstantial evidence. On the other continent is the belief that the flood myth is a shared metaphor. This is the conviction that the stories are not about a single event, but are the result of a universal human experience, either psychological or environmental. The evidence for this is the Earth's own testimony, the geological silence, the profound lack of any physical proof for a synchronous global flood. This continent is supported by the powerful and elegant explanation of the human mind itself. You see the story as a Jungian archetype, a universal symbol of psychic death and rebirth that our minds are hardwired to generate. You see it as a cultural trauma narrative, a necessary psychological tool for processing the horror of any existential catastrophe, be it local or global. And you have the mainstream scientific consensus, the theory of countless localized floods, each giving birth to its own exaggerated mythologized memory. This path is grounded in established science and psychology. Its weakness is its struggle to explain the bizarrely specific shared details of the narrative blueprint. It explains why there are flood stories, but not why they are all the same story. You are left standing between these two worlds, between a shared memory and a shared metaphor. One gives you a thrilling, unified history, but requires you to believe in things for which there is little proof. The other gives you a rational, scientific explanation, but requires you to accept a coincidence of storytelling that feels almost miraculous in its own right. Perhaps in the end the mystery cannot be solved. Perhaps its power lies in the fact that it will not be contained by any single explanation. The Great Flood myth is like the flood itself. Its waters seep through the cracks of every discipline we have. It is a geological question, a historical paradox, a psychological drama, a spiritual allegory, and a modern-day warning. It is a story about the end of the world that, paradoxically, has proven to be immortal. It has survived the civilizations that first told it, and it will likely survive our own. The waters of this great mystery, it seems, will never fully recede. They leave you standing on the shore of your own understanding, inviting you to look upon the horizon and decide for yourself whether the echoes you hear are from a world that is long gone, or from one that is still struggling to be born. So, where does that leave us? We're faced with a story that is etched into the bedrock of human consciousness, a tale of a drowned world told by cultures who should never have been able to speak to one another. Was it the memory of a real global cataclysm, a comet, a pole shift, the end of the Ice Age, an event that scarred our collective memory forever? Or is it a reflection of our own inner landscape, a universal archetype of destruction and rebirth that our minds are destined to create? We've explored the evidence, from the geology of the Black Sea to the pages of Plato, from ancient astronauts to the very structure of the human mind. The final verdict remains elusive, hidden in the mud and silt of a forgotten age. What this investigation proves, beyond all doubt, is that the memory of a great flood is one of humanity, its most essential and enduring stories. The question that remains is whether it's a memory of water that once drowned our world, or a warning about the water that is yet to come. You are the investigators now. The files are open. That's all for today. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next file.